this meeting to order. First order of business is the approval of the agenda. And we'll just started. You're right there.
Move approval.
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor of the agenda as written, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Approval of summary minutes. The minutes were emailed just a couple hours ago. So I'll take a couple minutes for those of you who haven't read them yet to read them. And let me know if there's any additions or corrections. Kind of look this way when you're done. Okay, if there are no additions or corrections, I'll entertain a motion to accept the minutes.
So moved.
Second? You can second. All those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Okay, thank you very much. That brings us to public comment. Anyone sign up for public comment? Very much. We have 4 people signed up for public comment: Jonathan Siegel, Charles Arison, I don't know if it's Tad or Todd. Tad. Neminsky. Richard Shine and Nora and Nola? Anaya. Why? Okay. Mr. Siegel, yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you for all your hard work. I want to make it clear I'm speaking here as an individual, although you probably know that I sit on the Police Oversight Commission. My remarks are my own as a private citizen. Mainly I wanted to make a comment on some work that I think you're in process of finalizing, having to do with the scale and size of the next commission, whatever it may look like. And I would give my strongest recommendation to consider 9 people for that commission. I say this because I have sat 6 years and a little more on the City Planning Commission, which had membership of 9, and had a hard time at times making quorum, owing to illness, owing to occasional seats being vacant, and the rest. So likewise, the Police Oversight Commission has 9 slots on it. Presently 7 are filled, and with a few absences and so forth, you can get down to a fairly low number. So it would be my strongest recommendation that you consider 9, not 7. And as an aside, I would offer as one scenario the following balance: that 3 be selected by the mayor, 3 be selected by city council, and 3 by outside interested groups. That would mean that none of those could outweigh the other as an interest group, not council, not the mayor, and not the interest groups, but they'd all be in balance reasonably so with each other. Would I think therefore provide at least the person power for a good commission. I'll stand for any questions if you have them.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Charles Harrison.
Yeah, I just wanted to say again, you talked about the qualifications for the members of whatever board it is that they're going to have, and being citizens of Albuquerque. And once again, I want to disagree with that. I think anyone that's within the jurisdiction of the Albuquerque Police Department should be qualified to be on the commission. And I bring up that point from just what happened the other day, just a couple miles to my home in Rio Rancho, where several APD officers opened fire on a car in a major part of our town. A lot of innocent bystanders walking around, and of course it didn't stop the vehicle. I spoke to some of the shop owners around the area, and everybody was ducking for cover. So I think that anyone should be eligible to be on the commission or whatever it's going to be, who is within the jurisdiction of the Elmhurst Police Department. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. Hi.
My name's Ted Nowinski, and well, he stole from me. That's exactly what I was gonna talk about the day we chased him to ground, and outside our jurisdiction. Well, that is another shooting, tires, and which is also, you know what I'm trying to say, not supposed to do it, that's, and anyway. My point is, there is some police officers being involved in, like one, he was last year, during 6 years, involved in 3 separate shootings of his service. Hitzler, I believe it, how you pronounce his name. Then another one at Wyoming, and one of Wyoming, and shooting at Wyoming and Indian School. One of them was in during 4 years, 2 separate shootings. And just, it is only an answer. All this using, yeah, I know, they don't using stick, rubber stick anymore. State trooper do, but APD does not. And it's too quick. Well, here is something. Uncontrolled ISO sticker. Use gun with 2 hands.
Thank
Well,
you.
You know what I'm trying to say. Here is stop, they have limited force. That's what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Shaw.
I'm next.
Yep.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As most of you already know, my name is Richard Shine. I'm currently a commissioner on the Police Oversight Commission. However, as always, I am not here representing the views of the commission or any other commissioner. The following comments represent only my personal opinions. I would like to share with you a new compromise suggestion on how to deal more effectively with the very important Garrity issue. In my legislative proposals that have been circulated to each of you, I suggested that the Garrity issue could be dealt with as the New York Civilian Complaint Review Board and a number of other civilian oversight organizations have dealt with it. That is, to treat all reviews of administrative investigations of officers as personnel matters, which they are, and conduct all such oversight hearings in a non-public executive session. It is now becoming clear that such a proposal might not be politically feasible in Albuquerque. In the alternative, the current ordinance could continue to require that commission hearings be conducted in public sessions, but be amended as follows. The commission is given the authority, the commission is given the authority to subpoena witnesses, including police officers, and administer oaths. 2, the commission shall adopt procedural rules for the taking of testimony from police officers before the full commission or a panel of the commission that comply with state law, including the Peace Officers Employer-Employee Relations Act, the so-called Police Officers Bill of Rights. And 3, police officers shall testify during the public commission hearing unless their officer's testimony has to be compelled pursuant to Garrity, in which case the testimony shall be taken in a non-public executive session. These amendments would give the commission access to the officer's testimony on those relatively rare occasions when it was needed by the commission, such as when the commission, not the IRO, should determine whether or not the officers lied during the administrative investigation, while at the same time reducing to an absolute minimum the need for a non-public commission proceeding. One last sentence.
Okay.
The amendments would also leave it to the commission's rulemaking process to develop a set of procedural rules that will be required to protect the police officer's rights under the Police Officers' Bill of Rights. And I have copies of the language that I just suggested here if the commission, if the task force wants.
Any questions?
I'd ask if they do.
I'm sorry?
I'd ask that we distribute it.
That's fine.
Mr. Senator, there are some copies.
Okay, yeah, I know, sure.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Commissioner Shine?
Yep.
Do you know whether your proposal currently is impacted by the contract, the current contract, or
It is not.
contractual changes have to be negotiated in order to meet the recommendations you're suggesting?
It is, what I'm proposing is not consistent with the current union contract. As I understood, what you were doing is you're trying to develop proposals, basically ignoring the contract and then let the negotiations of the contract and whatever provisions of the ordinance get adopted by the city council. But this, under the contract, this would not be permitted because the officer cannot be subpoenaed by the POC. And under the present ordinance, that's also the case. The officer only comes if he voluntarily chooses to appear in front of the commission, and nobody ever has. I would suggest that if you adopted this proposal, it may well be that officers could decide to testify publicly without being compelled, because they may decide that it's in their interest that they're going to have to come and testify anyway. But that's to be seen. Right now, in officer-involved shootings, I know that all the officers are waiving Miranda rights and giving statements, so they're not even compelled statements covered by Garrity. But you know, those statements are not being made available to the oversight committee.
Thank you. Mr. Nye.
I am here to put some input from the families. My nephew had been killed 24 years ago. He was 23 years old. The family never got any closure. No information was ever given to them to at least give them the definite pattern of what had happened the night he was shot and killed. I think that is such a pertinent, this is such a pertinent information for the simple fact that the families will never be able to say there was closure or they were satisfied with information, because it was bits and pieces that was given to them and never the information needed. One of the things that had happened with my nephew, they didn't even allow us to go to see his body to identify it. So things like that is so crucial for the family to get that closure. One other thing is vital in my eyes is the fact that steroids has been known to be used in the police force. There was an incident at one time. I had asked someone somewhere about the steroid use and if there was any chance that they would be able to get drug tested. And because it's so expensive, they refused to even consider it. And I'd like for you to do that if that's doable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Got a question. Are you at liberty to sharing your nephew's name?
Yes, I am. My nephew, Levi Chichias, was a 82nd Airborne, had gone to Grenada, and 3 months after he got back from Grenada. And I believe his only mistake was getting involved with the wrong woman that he had gone to a party with. And he was 23 when he got shot and killed.
Tochias, is his last name?
Levi Chichias.
Levi Tochias, thank you.
Mr. Wagner.
Yeah, I'd just like to suggest that with respect to what you're asking about on the
drug testing, a lot of policy for that, that you take that to the Police Oversight Commission, either this one or the one if there's one established under the new ordinance, because that's really out of what we can do, but that's an area of policy making that I personally hope that it's being done and will continue to be done by the Oversight Commission, not by this task force.
Thank you very much.
Do I understand that your nephew was killed by a policeman?
Yes, ma'am, there was a trajectory bullet that had gone through the driver's side as he was driving down Atrisco with his girlfriend, taking her to the hospital. And he was shot and killed instantly, therefore she had a chance of surviving, but his girlfriend actually was, died on scene also. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay, next item on the agenda is recommended facilitation. Mr. Carpa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the task force. Good evening. Good evening. The purpose of this discussion is to come to decisions on the chief of the essential recommendations of the Police Oversight Task Force to the City Council for the draft report that Dr. Perlman and his team is going to. So we're down to the decision-making discussion. And I have a suggested process, and this is upon advice of the management subcommittee as well. But it revolves principally around the draft recommendations that staff put together based upon the conversation we had at last month's meeting where those who weren't there, we had a couple of panels with a lot of common memory stuff that I had written up there, and the circle things in red that seem to have some emerging consensus from the task force. And so what we have done is to try to frame these as recommendations. I want to say, I already told Steph this and Ms. Yard that any mistakes in editorial judgment are mine. Although I could say if the tomatoes start getting thrown, I'll try to rope Ms. Yara and Dr. Coleman.
Yes, we have those tomatoes.
No, but it was an honest attempt by staff to try to draft these as recommendations. Following that, of course, we have a suggested or proposal for language for a preamble and a summary that has been circulated among the task force members as well. So we need to take that up. And if there are any outstanding issues, then we need to also talk about those. So we have until, I believe, is it 8:15?
That's good. We're going to shoot for.
So we're going to be, we may have to move along pretty well. What I'm suggesting is we have an informal discussion. Steph is going to be, we're going to try to do this electronically so we can maybe amend things directly or at least put notes or comments by the respective recommendations. And what I'm proposing is that we actually begin to, we catalog these under 3 main goals. And I'd like to just briefly review each set of goals, or each set of recommendations under the respective goals, and then have discussion as a set of goals, because under each goal, those recommendations sometimes intertwine. So rather than taking them one by one, I'd like to present them as a set and then have this discussion. So 1 to 3, 4 to 7, and 8 to 10. And so I've been asked to move this along. As long as we are there's a full and fair discussion. If there is no emerging consensus, then as long as we have the positions known, then we'll mark that and move on to the next one. Okay? And then, because at the end, of course, this has to return back to the formal process of getting motions and having votes. Last, I would please encourage you to make any changes framed as improvements, rather than merely explaining why this is you're dissatisfied with a particular wording, a particular concept, you'd say, well, this doesn't work and I have an alternative. I think that will move things along with a lot more alacrity, if you will. Okay? Got it?
Oh.
So if you will, here we go. So under goal 1, these goals also, I should say, the 6 essential questions that we came up with in December have, I think, kind of collapsed into these 3, and we may expand them again. But the first goal is the civilian oversight process will have a greater level of independence. There are 3 recommendations proposed at this point, draft recommendations. One is on mediation. Greater emphasis should be placed on mediation as a method for conflict resolution for citizen and police complaints. Mediation services should be obtained from agencies outside of city government. And then within parentheses, which should be a complete sentence, mediators should not have a direct relationship to APD or should not be or have been an employee of APD. Number 2, the citizen oversight process will be structured as a quasi-public agency. I understand that to be an agency that's created by statute, but maybe not directly accountable to a single elected person body, and have a staff that reports to a board. So the agency would include the current and preserve the general functions of the current commission and IRO, but represent a change in structure, if you will. Since this was put out, a comment around B, the Accountability in Government Ordinance, upon further examination of that, it might be inferred that this is a recommendation to adopt it nearly wholesale rather than just take some ideas from it. So staff is actually saying this probably should be deleted because it may create more problems in office. But C, then the agency will administer its own budget and supervise its own personnel, which would include the investigative officers. And 3, the Citizen Oversight Agency will have a dedicated and independent source of funding determined by some specific metric, for example, a percentage of the total APD budget or per capita amount per police officer. So I'm wearing 2 hats. I'm presenting. I can stand for direct questions, but I'd like to now move to more of a discussion manager, moderator role. So what comments does anyone have about these recommendations? Does this reflect the general sense of the task force, or what improvements need to be made? Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think it does reflect the consensus we reached last week. I do want to make sure that we are removing B, so is everyone in agreement with that? Okay, so we can take that out. I don't know how this is going to work. Is someone going to, oh, okay.
Stephanie, and
Oh, there she is, okay.
Andy or Bruce, are you going to maybe redundantly, you can maybe make some notes along the way? Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Kingswood.
Oh, wait.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. My
Sorry.
apologies.
2 other things. Under number 1, the second line where we have agencies, I think that would be improved by changing the word agencies to entities.
Was it public entities? Entity?
Yes, obtained from entities outside of.
Oh, I see, the mediation one here.
Right.
Got it.
Number 1, okay. And then on number 3, A, funding will be determined by a specific metric. For example, I think we should add right there an amount equal to a percentage of the total APD budget, because that confuses people. They think we're talking about taking part of the APD budget, and it's not, it's just used, it's there to be used as a metric. So we should add an amount equal to.
All right,
Those
thank
are my
you.
only changes.
Ms. Kingswood?
Mr. Chairman got my change on 3, I appreciate that. I just want to be clear about eliminating B. I thought we were using that as a possible model, as a construct to look at, as opposed to saying let's cut and paste the whole cloth. my concern about eliminating it, since it is something that people can look to as a model, it seems like finding words to say this may serve as a model would be helpful, as opposed to having no guidance at all about what a quasi-public agency might look like. So I was thinking of keeping it with some modification that could say, may serve as a model for further guidance on structure and governance.
All right, thank you. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
I actually went and looked at this very carefully, this accountability in government ordinance, and I read it thoroughly. In my personal opinion, it's a very bad model. It's not a good model at all, even as a model for a new police oversight board. It has things in it like, there's 5 positions. 3 of the positions are defined in there. They are a CPA, someone out of law or law enforcement, and an outside consultant. I mean, that's just one example. I could go through other examples, talk about how replacements are done, I believe is a wrong approach. I just went through it. There's a lot of things that are not applicable.
Are there any other comments about this, Mr. Berletti? And then
Yeah,
Ray?
since I was one of the ones that actually proposed that in a subcommittee report, my intent was never to take that government accountability ordinance and go through and mirror it in any significant way. I was trying to give examples of what a quasi-public agency might look like. And I think I actually cited several things in my draft memorandum at that time. One was this. The other one was an old urban development agency that I was familiar with, which I never did find the actual ordinance that governed it, so I kind of abandoned that one later on. And then there is actually state law that provides for what is called an inspector general. That might be another way of looking at it. Each one of those have some merit to beginning to define a quasi-public agency. I was just trying to use those as example, never intending to really take, how the committee selected or any of that.
Thank you, Mr. Bray.
Just as a suggestion, it sounds like it's a model out there that works, it's one for some agency, for the agency out there. And there may be some value to be gained from it. I see the word there, will provide, maybe as a way to improve, and you have to feel that there is some value to this model that it may provide further guidance, so it can be used as a doctrine down the road to take, if there is good, it might be able to use.
Did you read it?
So, yes, Ms. Kingsford, and then Mr. Whitlock, Ms. Kingsford.
Based on Mr. Lippman's comments and Mr. Berletti's comments, I withdraw my suggestion that we keep it. It sounds like quasi-governmental or quasi-public agency is something that we could actually use to find various statutes or ordinances that could be looked at rather than.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
let them
I
find it.
withdraw
And I don't really have a problem. I just said that because I was one of the ones that
Right.
proposed it initially, so that's fine.
So if
We're
that,
back to-
Just the concept is a good one. Obviously, if I may, just one more thing. Obviously, whatever, if in fact, we agree and the council approves the concept of structuring it that way, obviously there's gonna be an ordinance written, and somebody else is gonna be doing that. So, I mean, it's a conceptual
Right.
piece.
Thank you.
got it, Mr. Arnett.
If we don't use this as a model for guidance and structure, then do we have an alternative that we would propose to use?
That's a good question. Mr. Chairman.
I would suggest not. I think that we're getting into, remains to be seen, but just from this first set of recommendations, I think we're getting into sufficient detail about what we're asking for, rather than trying to look for something that may look, along the lines of, because to be honest with you, and no offense to any particular entity within the city government, But when I read that ordinance, I was pretty shocked. I mean, it had, in my view, very little relation to what we're doing. There may be some elements in there, there's a lot of accounting work, oversight, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. Audits. A lot of audits in that ordinance, which I thought was a good idea, might be included, but there was so much that wasn't applicable. And I think that you'll probably find that in almost any ordinance. So to look at them.
So to summarize, there was an initial idea that there could be some guidance from another city ordinance. However, putting it in, referring to it, it may lead others to infer that it's a wholesale
Right.
Endorsement and just a wholesale application. At this point then, there is no specific reference, Mr. Arianes. If you have a suggestion that we could.
How about using the IG, the Inspector General, some of the language that, or some of the ordinance that they're using, and the language that created that position in as a point of reference?
I have not read it. Have you read it?
No, but it's, you know, the Inspector General.
Well, excuse me.
The IG, you're talking about the city ordinance?
Right.
It's actually modeled right after this one. It goes in hand with the internal audit department. So it's going to be very similar to
What we have here, which doesn't seem to be.
I didn't think so.
If I mark, excuse me, if I may, I'm thinking that it's probably time to move along because we've got this pretty well discussed. At this point, general sense is, as it reads, is probably not very helpful. The discussion, and this may be something for Dr. Perlman and his group to think about. I'm going off script here a little bit, but maybe there is a reference for some guidance that the council could refer to, but that's for the report. Sounds like this particular reference is not carrying the day. So, are there any other comments about the fundamental, the major recommendations here on 1 to 3? Mr. Erickson and Mr. Wright.
I'd recommend that this last parenthetical sentence in number 1 be changed to something like, mediator should be independent of the oversight agency and the APD and should not be a former APD employee, so that it's clear that the mediator is somebody who's really an independent mediator who's not, for example, an employee of the oversight body.
Would I be correct in inferring that we ought to take this out of the parentheses and just say, third sentence, how did you say, mediators?
Mediator should be independent of the oversight body and APD and should not be former APD employees.
Did you get that step? Should be independent of the oversight body and APD and should not be a former employee. Any other comments? Yes, Ms. Armino. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Wagman, you're next.
No, go ahead.
Okay, Ms. Armino.
The agency will administer its own budget and supervise its own personnel. What do you mean by its own personnel?
The idea was that all staff would be staff of the quasi-public agency.
What you're saying, the IRO?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Minority opinion, I'm totally against that.
Okay, and would you have what would you propose instead of that?
This is just what I've noticed, that they seem to, other than Mr. Shine, all the commissioners seem to have a very good relationship with the IRO. And every single one of them told us that they got along fine, that the IRO did a great job, and they had no problem. So I don't know that has to happen. I think they're doing as well as they can with the lack of personnel that they have. I just don't think that people who have no investigative experience should come in and tell a bunch of investigators how to investigate. But that's for my own background.
Are there other comments on that? There might be different interpretations of what the staff board relationship would be, but that's certainly one that people might infer from that type of structure. No, Mr. Wagner.
Well, just, I disagree with Ms. Armijo, but I just want to make clear that my disagreement is not based upon anything having to do with the current people on the commission or the current IRO. It's a structural issue. And I structure. It said here, but I'm concerned about A, yeah, to the extent that it implies that the responsibilities will remain the same as opposed to, different. And I think perhaps it might say this agency, the Citizen Oversight Agency, will be responsible for all citizen oversight and will employ staff to assist it.
Did everybody hear that? Could you repeat that, sir?
This agency, the Citizen Oversight Agency, will be responsible for all citizen oversight duties and will employ staff to assist in the performance of its responsibilities. Will or may? I'm sure it's going to be will.
All oversight.
Responsibilities.
Or duties.
Duties, for all oversight.
Or
duties.
functions, you could even say functions.
Okay, functions. And, I'm sorry.
May or shall. Will.
Whatever, will, let's go with will for a moment. Will, what was the assessment?
Will employ staff.
Will employ staff to carry out those duties or
Or to it, yeah, under its direction.
So, I will say that the staff intent was to make sure there was some explicit connection between what's now and what's proposed, but you're saying that that would lead to unnecessary and imprecise inferences about what's being proposed. Okay, got it. Yes, Ms. Kingsbury and Mr. Chairman.
To use Steph's language, we're trying to rebrand, so if we use the same words, then it may be that people are going down that road without really hearing the rest of it, so I appreciate the suggestion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I really want to try and avoid doing this, wordsmithing back and forth, but I really thought it was written better the other way, and I would suggest a different change.
Okay.
What it said was, we left it with an A and a C, or an A and a B, because we're taking what was B out. A said, this agency, and this is what was objected to, this agency will include the current commission and IRO functions. And the problem with that is, and I agree, is using those terms might imply that we're not changing anything.
Okay.
So, but the sentiment for that was, actually Nancy, you made I remember a big point about this, that we wanted to continue with the concept of a civilian overview board and an independent review officer. That's why that was put in. So what we could maybe do is just that sentence alone, this agency will include, or we could say, among other things, will include the current commission and IRO function, or something like that, which implies that it's different, but still reflects the general concept of what was before.
Okay. So here's it's sort of a both and. The idea that, as Mr. Wagner said, we just talk about the oversight functions and we'll appoint staff to carry out those functions under its direction, and some explicit reference to the present body as the chair's language supposes. Give it a shot? Let's give that a shot. Okay. If there are no other comments on the first three, let's move to the second goal.
Okay, hold on, let me capture.
Thank you.
So include the current.
Well, actually, you'd be taking this out.
Yeah.
Just that, right, and put it back.
Because you have the personnel and stuff in what is now B.
I take your word, Mr. Chairman, about not wanting to get too much into the weeds about wordsmithing, and yet these are very important
Right,
community bodies and community functions, and so some explicit reference may be helpful, and so I think the task force members are trying to balance.
Just tell me the last part of the sentence.
Let's see, this agency will be responsible for all oversight.
Commission and IRO functions.
Okay, so you still want to use that language?
Which, among other things, may include or will include the current commission and functions? Or IRO functions?
IRO.
Okay. All right, goal 2. There are 4 recommendations here.
You okay, Steph?
The goal is that the civilian oversight agency, now we're using that term, will be invested in clearer and broader authority. 4, the civilian oversight agency will have authority to recommend disciplinary action from the chart of sanctions for sustained civilian police complaints, and the APD chief must respond in writing if the recommended disciplinary action is not imposed. Number 5, the civilian oversight agency, and it implied is as its primary function, will have authority to recommend changes to APD policy, training programs, and procedures. Again, the APD chief must respond in writing to those recommendations indicating which will be followed. Number 6, the civilian oversight agency will have greater access to civilian complaints, court complaints, and internal affairs case data to allow greater analysis and understanding of trend data.
On
On A?
yeah.
Let me just read
Indicating which
Which A?
recommendations, 5A.
Oh, okay.
Indicating which recommendations will be followed and explaining why those recommendations which are not to be followed are not, something.
And explain, okay.
And explaining for those recommendations which are not being followed, the reason why.
And let me just read number 7. For all civilian officer interaction complaints will be routed directly to the civilian oversight agency regardless of source. And 7A is almost like a however, all internal APD complaints not relating to civilian officer interaction will be handled by particular areas. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Whiteman. Any other, Ann, did you get that?
Okay.
Okay. As to why? They are not being followed. As to why those not being followed are not followed, or something like
All right, I need to go back.
And explanations to why those not being followed.
those not being followed, as to why those not being followed are not. That's a little,
That's kind of redundant.
Yeah.
No?
actually not, because you have to refer to what, it's a distinction between those that are being followed and those aren't being followed.
It's wordy.
It is wordy. Okay. So, given that, comments and suggestions, Mr. Lloyd and Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bray.
Number 7, where it talks about all civilian officer interactions, you're talking about overwhelming the pot. You're talking about someone calls in about an officer speeding, an officer talking on his cell phone, an officer doing this or that. You're gonna overwhelm the pot.
I don't, okay, I think that I agree with you. I don't think that was the intent of that. An officer speeding is a violation of department rules, not an officer interacting.
It's only,
Yeah, we're talking about,
Okay, so there needs to be an additional criterion or an explanation of what these complaints.
yeah, well, it's an interaction complaint, and an officer speeding is not an interaction.
So a way to describe that.
Is there a way to describe like one-on-one in physical contact or something where it's
direct interaction.
direct interaction?
All civilian officer direct interaction.
All complaints about direct civilian officer interaction.
All complaints
Well, you can use that direct in front of the. Instead of making it
about
longer.
About
direct.
civilian officer, and then take out the.
I'm going to take this one out. How's that?
That's fine.
Mr. Prater? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, 2 things. In the statement of the goal itself, the Civilian Oversight Agency will be invested with, and I'm just suggesting a word change to make it clearer. Instead of the word clearer, clearly defined and broader authority. The reason I say that is because one of the problems with the current ordinance was that it didn't clearly define things. Case in point, the relationship between the IRO and the POC needed a legal opinion from the city attorney's office. and it should be clearly defined in the ordinance. The other thing is 6A.
Yes.
This will allow greater analysis and understanding of trend data to support recommended policy changes. I want to add to support recommended policy changes. It reinforces the reason why we want the trend data, and it reinforces the concept that this new board, we want to spend a significant amount of time on looking at trends and potential policy changes.
Thank you. Mr. Brand.
A couple of things. First, 7A, it appears the way that it's currently written is that it really removes a lot of first-line supervisor discretion. It says all civilian officer interaction complaints. There are a lot of complaints, and maybe something, a very, very minor complaint that might not rise to the level of an internal affairs complaint. And it removes, again, all that informal sort of resolution to a lot of these issues.
So I take your point. Is there a way we could improve the language there, or if anybody has a way of doing that? Yeah. And Mr. Bray is saying that this really takes the supervisor's responsibility off the table and puts everything into, could be inferred as shoving everything into IA, overloading that system.
That's right, and it appears to mandate certain type of action.
Right.
Again, I think the vast majority of interaction complaints are dealt at the lowest level possible. And this removes that. So by way of a suggestion,
yes,
all complaints about all complaints about harassment, officer interaction.
Anyway, yes, is there we flagged something, is there something?
I think the intent of that was currently if a complaint is about a civilian officer interaction is lodged by another officer, it goes to IA. The only intent of this was to redirect those complaints to the Oversight Commission, not to create, the problem that Mr. Perea is talking about.
So, yes, so is there a way to make it?
If we change internal affairs, if we change that to will be handled by APD policy. And right now, policy of APD, if there's a case that's supposed to go to internal affairs, it does. If there's one that can be handled by a supervisor, it is.
Yeah, but let APD decide how.
So,
yeah.
Does that work for you?
Yes.
Thank you for that. Any other comments on 4 through 7?
I do have comments as we can on the board.
Yes.
There are a couple subcommittees that have got the issue of authority recommend disciplinary action. And one of the committees that I sit on, POC, we really didn't have the opportunity to really tease out some important questions related to that recommendation. And one of the other subcommittees did. I think that's a huge issue. I'm not sure that we as a committee really talked about a lot of the intricate details associated with the POC making recommendations by way of qualifications as far as what is needed in order to make disciplinary recommendations. And there are a lot of other issues that I really don't think that we consider before we make this recommendation. I think there's too many unanswered questions. So my concern is to even have the civilian oversight agency to be given the authority to recommend disciplinary action. I think raises some concerns.
So your recommendation is to remove number 4?
That would be my recommendation at this point, pending further and more depth conversation and discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Kingsbury.
I respectfully disagree. Recommendations are recommendations, and they would come from I understand there's a list of recommendations, disciplinary actions that that can be selected from. So it's an opportunity to begin to create a public dialogue, and if we all agree that the ultimate responsibility is the chief's, and what this does is gives an opportunity for the public to understand the chief's thinking and for the oversight agency to share its thinking, but there's never an opportunity for an overrule. It's beginning to get more public discussion about what goes on. So I think there's some value to that.
I mean, let me ask if there are any other comments on the, yes, Mr. Arias?
I believe to keep it as it is, we have to have some accountability. And, you know, if a complete investigation has been conducted by the Civilian Oversight Agency, and they have recommended some action because he sustained some findings, I think there should be some respect to the time that has been invested to investigate the issue and the findings that have been recommended. And so I vote to keep it as.
So these are sustained complaints?
These are sustained.
Gone through the process?
I've been investigated and sustained.
Okay. Any other comments on this on either side or a different side of this issue? So back to you, Mr.
Again,
Perez.
and this appears to get the COA involved in all complaints. Just, we talked about bogging this group down.
Yeah.
This seems to be a huge undertaking by a board who's already mentioned that they're limited as far as time is concerned. And,
Right.
But we're talking, you know, recommendations on all complaints. I think we're opening up a can of worms that we really need to think through before we make this recommendation.
Any other comments? Yes, Mr. Wagman and the chair.
Having the authority does not mandate making a recommendation. They don't have to do it. They can answer something and say, we don't want to get involved in this.
Chairman?
I just want to echo, I think it should stay in as well, and I didn't quite follow your last comment, Mr. Paray, about overwhelming them and its relation to
If I may-
recommending sanctions.
Well, Mr. Bregg can speak, but my inference is he's, just as we've said otherwise, the opportunity may mean that they take it wholeheartedly and spend their limited time in generating lots of recommended disciplinary action. Is that a fair assessment?
And it is, but it also gives the COA the opportunity to pick and choose and maybe start going down the road of possibly, to use this term lightly, politics. In other words, some will be reviewed at the POC, the POA will then take the position, well, let's deal with this one, not that one. And I think it just creates this sense of unfairness. Why is this recommendation made for this case, and there's a similar case where a recommendation wasn't made? And I think it just, again, it opens up for too many issues as they arise.
Take a couple more comments. Ms. Kenningsburg, and then over to Mr. Wagner. You pass? Yes.
I just wonder what Mr. Prey would propose instead.
He said take it out. I'm sorry to jump in, but that, I heard him earlier say.
Yeah, he did, okay.
And that would be my recommendation, until we have further discussion on all the possible
Yeah, we
intricacies
don't-
involved. And we may not have time,
Yeah, we
if
don't.
we don't have time, it may be prudent then to take it out until someone has the opportunity to look into this issue further.
So what I've heard is that most of the comments have said that the recommendation should allow the agency to have this authority to comment on and make recommendations about disciplinary action for investigated sustained complaints. Mr. Pereira is saying this may open up, excuse this precise term, a can of worms about sense of unfairness or the agency being overwhelmed. So I think that's the two sides of what I've heard so far. Is that pretty clear? If so, I'd like to say let's then leave this for the vote and any discussion under the motion there and move ahead. Okay.
Okay.
So any other comments on recommendations 4 through 7? In that case, let's go to goal 3. And here I apologize for some errors, and there's some errors here. So commission should all be either eliminated or replaced by civilian oversight agency. So the civilian oversight agency will have sufficient community representation and appropriate range of expertise. The recommendations include so far that members of the COA would be determined by a process that has several elements. One is that there'd be a selection committee formed, designated by the city council. We did not make an attempt at saying how many 3, 5, 7, whatever for the committee. Prospective board members or agency board members must apply according to a set of minimum guidelines, and those that were raised last week included 60 hours of college credit, City of Albuquerque residency, and a successful background check. And then that our take was that we should designate who has final selection authority, and that would still be within the city council, we think. Number 9, although there were a number of numbers that were discussed last week, it seemed that 7 was the one that was most frequently recommended. And then on number 10, the agency members or board members will or shall complete a specific training program which may consist of these ideas that were listed last week. Comments on any or all of that? Mr. Berletti, then we'll come up this side and go down to that side if you don't mind. Yes.
Yeah, the 60 hours of college credit issue is a concern of mine from the perspective that we have talked about this board having broad representation from the community, and by that I understand it to mean in particular from the segments of the community that have the most interaction with APD. And so therefore we're talking, minority groups, certain other segments of the community, which are actually the ones that statistically at least have less opportunities to have a higher education. And so I'm afraid that we might be cutting some folks out that may be leaders in the community of key organizations, but they can't meet this one requirement, but they could bring a lot of value to the table in many other ways, culturally or whatever.
Thank you. Mr. Webb.
I'm very much inclined to agree with Mr. Bertolotti. I'm the one that suggested the 60 hours, and that was because that's what required of Albuquerque Police Department officers, and my concern was officers being upset because it takes less qualification to sit in judgment on an officer than it does to become an officer. I would like to hear from people closer to the ground on that issue before I make a final decision.
Mr. Lloyd, I think you're up next.
Okay, let me respond to that when I come back to a couple issues I have. I think you're right that statistically minorities will have fewer degrees, but I don't think we have a shortage of degrees amongst the minorities now because we have such a huge population. My wife's Native American, my daughter-in-law is Hispanic, both have degrees. I've got other family members that don't, but I don't think we have a lack of college degrees amongst minorities in Albuquerque because we are such a huge minority population. I'll stop there and then I'll come back to something else I have.
Please, go ahead. If you have another comment.
Is this a time, while we're talking about this very issue, adding requirements to the a POC member, I would like to see no arrests and no complaints filed against APD in the previous 5 years. It just takes out someone that I'm really ticked off.
How about no convictions?
No convictions
Who's
is
the
fair.
successful background check?
So, maybe an explanation. No felony
We
convictions?
should further
No,
define that.
no convictions.
No convictions at all is the recommendation.
My recommendation.
No convictions,
Is
nor
the-
complaints against
Prior
APD
complaints.
within the past 5 years.
And it don't have to be a felony to be pretty serious. I mean, it could be domestic violence, it could be anything that's not rising to the level of felony.
a felon. It could be.
I mean, there could be all kinds of things. But back to what you were saying, I think that there's a lot of degrees amongst the minority population now.
Okay, so, excuse me, by influence then, you would go back to Mr. Wagman's original rationale of someone who sits in judgment of an officer must have somewhat similar experience.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I think, I can't remember, I think it was Mr. Pereira, was a read? Yes.
Just a couple of comments with regards to the minimum qualifications and the 60 college credit hours. We realize there are a lot of college students out there, but I've known of so many capable and competent individuals who are very aware of what's taking place in the community, very astute and understanding of politics and everything associated with what may be taking place in the community. And I think to require that 60 hours, college hours, actually cuts an entire group of individuals who may not have had a desire to go to college. They may be in business and own their own business and never attend college. They might be a great entrepreneur. And so I think that we really risk cutting off a lot of very qualified people and treating a lot of people off. The idea here is to get buy-in from the community, get input from the community, and if we exclude that population because they chose not to or they were unable to, for whatever reasons, I think it just doesn't make the credibility appear so much. It gives the
Kim, I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm
Go ahead.
sorry. Where I'm standing, maybe I'm contributing to that. My apologies. Mr. Pereira is saying that the 60 hours could eliminate a number of very well-qualified community members. It's not irrespective of what ethnicity or race they might be, just their life opportunities and decisions, it might cut people out. So you're saying you would prefer not to have that as one of the criteria?
Not to have the 60 hours. Without that being said, if we are going to ask down the road that the vote moves in that direction, that the Civilian Oversight Agency takes into account and makes disciplinary recommendations, now we're talking about another much higher level of qualifications. So that you have those who have the skill and background in order to make those types of informed decisions. Because when you're talking about a police officer's livelihood, you want someone there that has the qualifications in order to make the best possible decision under the circumstances. So there's that risk there.
And I'm going to suggest, Tim, that we might want to take 8, 9, and 10 separately. Because I have things for all three, and I don't want to bring them all up now because they're complicated issues in and of themselves, each of them. So
We
with
have
number
started
8,
on number 8, so let's continue on number 8. Good point.
okay, so let me focus on my things with number 8. The first is about the 60 hours. I'll comment on that first. I have been close to the ground for many years, and there are many capable people who do not have college degrees, and there are other ways to structure the composition of the board that can bring in expertise, etc. They don't have to be all 7 or 9 open positions. They could be people that we structure, just much like the way this task force was structured. And I'll get into that if we want to deal with that here. The other thing is, we said that City Council will form a selection committee. I was very concerned about that language. It's too open-ended. If I'm sitting as a community activist and I know that a selection committee is going to pick the police oversight board, I'm going to wonder who's sitting on that selection committee. Who's picking those people? What qualifications do they have? What guidance do they have in picking people to serve on the police oversight board, etc.? So I have a couple of recommendations. First is, and I think the most important thing is, let's put a number limit on it, and I'm going to suggest 5. For one thing, 5 is less than 9, which is the city council. So it won't be a case where each counselor will recommend someone to sit on this selection committee. Then I struggled with, well, should we put some other kind of criteria on there to help define the who and the how? And make sure that the public felt confident that the selections that were made reflect the public. So I struggled with this a great deal. But I ultimately came to the conclusion that if we leave it at 5, but we set some criteria for who the 7 or 9 board people would be, that would give some guidance to this committee, and I think we could leave it to the wisdom of the council, given some guidelines for who should sit on it, the wisdom to pick the right people for a selection committee.
Got it, thank you. Mr. Arias? and then-
Yeah, I think we should remove the 60 hours credit. I think it's too exclusionary. It excludes too many in the population in Albuquerque, and particularly the minority community. I mean, that's not even required for somebody that wants to run for mayor or city council. And I don't even know if that's part of what required for an APD, but certainly not for the city council or for the mayor. And then I think that, you know, if a jury can recommend a guilty verdict and recommend a sentence or whatever, then I think that it should be able to apply for someone on the Police Oversight Commission that doesn't have 60 hours. So I think they're very capable of, you know, a common man can view a situation and realize that there was a major injustice or not.
Okay, thank you. Christine.
After listening to the discussion, I'm agreeing with eliminating the 60 hours of college credit. Point 2, listening to Mr. Arceus, I didn't realize that APD had jurisdiction outside of the city limits. I had no clue. So we're talking about any place that APD goes. So therefore, it seems to me that anybody who could be involved with APD should has as much right to participate if they so chose.
Okay.
I don't know where those boundaries
So-
are, so.
Excuse me, so it might be a
So the
place of residence within
The
APD jurisdictional
jurisdiction.
boundaries.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And then,
And just a second.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
I don't think it has jurisdiction outside the city.
Yeah,
oh,
why don't you go
well,
ahead
then
through
that- I
your.
mean, I'll be happy to be corrected. I mean, I understood from the comment that was made that APD was involved
They were.
outside, and that was
But
wrong.
they were out of their
They were out-
jurisdiction.
So let's get this clear. Is so APD only has jurisdiction within the city of Albuquerque. So if there's an officer involved in something outside of city limits,
A couple things.
I believe it's only in hot pursuit,
There,
am I right?
well, there's a commission card that other jurisdictions can provide to APD officers. For example, APD may have jurisdiction if the sheriff grants APD officers a commission to operate in the county. And so it's something
Well,
that's,
then let's leave the jurisdiction thing in there.
So are you recommending now changing the that guideline for who might apply to?
well, again, I mean, it's, you know, it's amazing how much we've been doing this, and I'm learning something new every second. It sounds like it's a complicated thing that flows, there's no, I mean, I'm picturing a map, and what you're saying is that it doesn't work that way. It depends on kind of a grant of authority from another law enforcement agency, which could be granted sometimes and not others. I mean,
that's correct. It's up to the head of that agency, the
Okay.
sheriff, the chief of
Okay.
the ranch, and
All right.
so on and so
Well,
forth.
there's another one. I'll go back to where it was.
Okay, pick up a new cue, Mr. Lloyd, I think Mr. Wagman, and then Ms. Armijo.
Yeah.
We'll get to.
Officers are on task forces throughout the state, so are we recommending that Socorro be on the city of Albuquerque Police Oversight Commissions?
So
We
you
have
rec-
task forces throughout the state.
Are you recommending that we maintain that 8B2?
Perhaps for the same argument, we argued the city council. City council has to be from the city of Albuquerque.
Got it. Thank you. Mr. Wagman?
Yeah, I think that just because there are ad hoc decisions to grant Albuquerque Police Department officers some authority on specific occasions outside the city limits, doesn't mean we're gonna start having, I think we restrict that to city. I think we can eliminate the 60 hours of college credit and actually close, and I don't know if this is, I'll propose it, it probably could be improved, demonstrated ability to engage in mature and impartial decision. And that can be as a result of an interview or as a result of experience, but instead of 60 hours of college credit. that-
Demonstrated ability to
To engage in mature impartial decision.
How do you measure that?
Okay, well, that's a recommendation.
Either somebody has experience doing it, or in an interview explains how they would handle situations.
So,
I mean, how do you assess somebody in an interview?
so it's a recommendation. If that doesn't seem to work, let's focus on alternatives. Ms. Armino, I think you're up next.
Okay, I agree with everybody else on the 60 hours, it should have never been recommended. And I also agree with Ed that you can't assume that minorities aren't college educated, because doors are opening up for us, and we're all, many of us are going to have to agree. And, well, I'm not gonna go on that subject,
Got it.
but, as to the not filing a complaint with the police within the last 5 years, I think that's a bad idea, because you can't assume that someone who's
No convictions.
No, actually, Mr. Loy's recommendation is, not as it's up here, will have not, it's number 4, this one, Roman numerals, well, 4.
Within the last 5 years.
I didn't see that.
I disagree with that. Because I filed a complaint last year, and truthfully, I think I've come in here with less bias than anyone on this subject. So if you can't assume that just because a person's done that, they have some experience at least in this process.
Okay, so we have 2 ideas about 8B4. And, Mr. Chairman, I think you're up next.
Yeah, I have a recommendation in terms of, or some recommendations in terms of the composition of the board and the terms of the board. We can either deal with it here where we've started to list some criteria and just added a couple more, or we can include it in number 9. I don't know how you want to do it.
I would respectfully say it's part of number 9. This is just even the application requirements that we obtain for everybody.
Well,
But that's just my first take.
I agree with that. It seems like we're still fleshing out some.
okay,
Yeah.
I can bring it up there. It's going to
Yes.
affect the application, but
It's true,
the
number
things I'm
9
going to
is a little,
suggest.
yes.
So we need to deal with
Right.
B4, is where the discussion is at the moment?
Yes, at this point, should, Ms. Armijo, Mr. Loy was saying that we don't want people who have just, they've got a grain of sand in their shoe about something. And Ms. Armijo says that really may not obtain the people who have filed complaints can still remain in function. So that's,
Prejudice, you can't assume that.
right. Mr. Loy, I think back to you.
I think it should stay. But with that said, Francis, the first night we were here, when you said you filed 2 complaints against AP. One. I was going, holy smokes, that's great. But my opinion of you is 100% turnaround. Nothing but respect. If I could put you on the board, I would. You'd be one of them right now. But I can't. So I have to be careful with my suggestions on who I think would be good and unbiased on the board. With that said, in my personal humble opinion, maybe I'll get in trouble for this, I think there may be a member or 2 on this board that don't like APD. And they got on this perhaps because of that. That's my humble opinion. I'm entitled to it, I think. So my concern is that I want an unbiased board. I don't care if they're unbiased. I don't care if they like the cops or don't like the cops. I just want someone that can be like you and say, you know, this is right or this is wrong based on these facts, not on if they got a blue uniform on or I don't have a suit on. So that's why I would like to keep that there. And yes, it's going to eliminate some, perhaps, absolutely. But I think a far more group it may keep all of those that are not.
Well, then you have to make it 5 years.
I think that's, oh, did I have to? 3 years? What for term limits were we looking for, Pop?
We hadn't gotten there yet. I was
I
going to say
can
4
do
years.
3. I can do 3.
Okay.
But I would like it there for the reasons I've stated.
Mr. Wagner?
I'm wondering, I don't know if I want to leave it vague or specific, but instead of saying we'll not have made any complaints, we'll not have made any, or more than, either any or more than a certain number, or engaged in a pattern of unsubstantiated complaints.
Yeah.
I think somehow, having filed a complaint shouldn't eliminate you, but somebody who's filing 17 unsubstantiated complaints, I don't know if you want to put a specific number, but you're vesting somebody who's making the selection with the ability, with the decision to make a determination, and maybe is not engaged in a pattern of unsubstantiated complaints.
So an alternative, well, alternative suggestion, don't erase this, but an alternative suggestion is, will not, instead of this one, another four would be, will not will not engage in a pattern.
Will not have engaged in a pattern of unsubstantiated.
Unsubstantiated complaints against APD.
Better.
And who's gonna determine that?
Whatever selection committee.
The selection committee.
Yeah. In some ways, number small v, small 5, is a way to guarantee that as well, it seems to me. If there's some kind of interviewing process of the. So may we can leave this in for the formal motion and vote, but most of the comments that I've heard recently say that this one is exclusionary and the original rationale, while worthy, may not work in practice. Is that okay to take
Yes.
that out? Okay. So we're taking out number 1, moving everything else up. And under number 3, I'm good with it. The 3-year, the second one is okay with you, Ms. Ginsburg?
Just to go to D1, we're striking the residency of the jurisdiction.
Yeah, so City of
we're
Albuquerque
sticking with the
residency
original one,
stays.
so I just want to make sure we strike that.
So we're striking the
Yeah.
Right.
The amendment's out. And the first alternative under 3 is now.
2, no non-traffic convictions. No non-traffic convictions.
Or criminal convictions.
Okay, so under number 2, instead of a blanket,
I see what you're saying. Well,
you're trying to stay away from minor convictions.
I'm trying to stay away from speeding.
Right.
Or parking.
Speeding is very bad.
Right.
How about yellow light?
So, is there another alternative? So you're.
Yellow sidewalk. I mean,
Please.
So, a successful background check, which would include no
Criminal. Why don't you just put criminal, no criminal convictions? Wouldn't that work? Those who are police, former police, lawyers.
Mr. Erickson.
Well, I think maybe we should say no criminal convictions, traffic accepted or something like that, traffic violations accepted.
Can you get a criminal conviction on traffic, I think?
Yes,
You can?
Yeah.
What, reckless driving?
Speeding, you could get a conviction.
Huh. The things you don't know.
So, Mr. Erickson's recommendation is that it's no convictions excepting moving violations?
I don't think there should be an exception.
You don't think there should be an exception?
Just no criminal conviction, period.
When somebody gets a speeding ticket, they can't be on.
I mean,
Well, in order for speeding to be a criminal conviction, I guess they'd
I
have
don't
to
know,
be
I don't know
going.
if we want Jim to make that judgment, you know what I'm saying? I mean,
If you get this, if you parse it, your point is if you parse it too much, you're, that died in my throat, sorry.
But we could use the term high court misdemeanors, DWIs, high court misdemeanors, or certain high court misdemeanors apply. Speeding is not a high court misdemeanor.
Let me back up and
We
ask-
could leave successful background check and leave it at that and let the committee figure it out.
That's true. What if this is the committee members had 15 DUIs?
Well, the selection committee is the one who's gonna look at the candidates.
So what's let me back up and ask the question, what's the intent behind number 2? You
To
wanna
not
make
have
sure-
criminals on the board.
Not have criminals. is it sufficient to say successful background check, or is it important to specify at least one criterion under that?
That is the
See, I'm trying to take this step by step
Yeah.
rather than
When
get.
you apply for a job, it's pretty cut and dry with criminal convictions. Period.
So Mr. Waits is saying, just say no criminal convictions in the last 5 years.
There was a background check for this task force. What was the background check?
You know what, the Human Resources Department
So
did
you don't
their
know.
background checks, and they just said pass or fail to us, so I am not sure what that.
But there
means.
is a standard that applies when you say background check. Maybe that's, I don't know. I don't know enough about it to say.
Mr. Lloyd?
I know that APD has some type of guidelines that say no felony convictions, no high court misdemeanors, and no convictions of moral turpitude, I believe. So I think that pretty much covers what we want.
Could we say no successful
Well,
background
why don't
check
you enumerate, maybe we should use those.
according to APD policy?
Well, that could be problematic though.
Right.
I don't know the extent of APD policy, everything that's in there. Somebody could pull some little policy thing out and say it conflicts with APD policy.
I don't know, I don't want to interject myself too much, but here's a suggestion. That you leave it at successful background check, period.
I'm okay with
But you know, if I'm batting 300 like in baseball, I'm doing real well on that stuff.
But I was just gonna say, I'm with Tim here, I don't think we should really even spend any more time on this, I'm not sure it's that important. As long as there is a background check, if somebody has 15 misdemeanor DWIs,
That'll
over
show.
the last 20 years, they're gonna know about it.
Right, the selection
As
committee is gonna take
long as
that
they're
into account.
looking at it and
The city
deciding.
council can figure that one out.
Well, the selection, yeah, I think so too.
So successful background check. And so the idea is though that there are some minimum guidelines, and these are not to be exclusive, but they're intended to provide some guidance to the council as it writes the ordinance.
I didn't agree to have that removed though.
Which one? This one, you think this should stay?
Yes, take it to a vote.
Okay, so that one should stay in, and there are two different points of, at least maybe more than 2 points of view on this one. So Mr. Lloyd, your point is no convictions within the last 5 years. Mr. Waits, you indicated some support for that, because
Yeah,
it's
to a
cut
certain
and dry.
degree, yeah. But I'm also in agreement with successful background check. I mean, if you got 15 tickets, that means you can't drive. You shouldn't be driving. That's common sense.
All right, so we have the respective positions here, Mr. Morelli. Let's go to I think number 9 is going to spark some conversation here. So any other comments on 8?
Yes.
Ms. Ginsburg.
See, the selection committee, this is related to that. I was intrigued by Mr. Siegel's suggestion about having the city council, the mayor, and outside groups each recommend 3 people to the city, make their recommendations to the city council, so that there's essentially an equal distribution amongst the major stakeholders, and then that the city council would then select. I'm intrigued by that notion, rather than having a selection committee, that the bodies make their recommendations, and then the city council select from the recommendations made from those 3 major stakeholders.
The outline here between 8C and 9 is a fuzzy boundary, so let's just sort of, if you don't mind, talking about the number and the constitution of this board. So let's just continue there. It may include your last comment, Ms. Ginsburg, but did you want to say anything else?
All right,
on that?
well, since you're collapsing them, and I'm also thinking that 9 makes more sense than 7.
So 9 makes more sense. Mr. Chairman?
Okay, what we have to talk about here is the number and the composition. So that's what I wanted to get into. I also think probably we're going to get to 9, but let me explain. I too am of the belief that having stakeholder groups represented on the board is a good idea. I've felt this for a long time, and it was discussed at length in the POC subcommittee. we came up with a formula, and the number they came up with was actually 9, but the number can flex based on this formula. And it was a number of experts and then a number of public positions. The experts coming from four different expert categories: a defense attorney, a prosecuting attorney, a public policy expert, and an unaffiliated police officer. By that, it was meant no one ever having affiliation with APD or Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office. If we went with 7, it would be 4 experts, 3 general public. If we went with 9, as the subcommittee recommended, you'd then have 4 experts and 5 general public. So the general public would outweigh the experts, which I think is a good formula. So I want to advocate for that kind of structure and giving that guidance to the selection committee. The last thing I wanted to say is, in terms of term, I gave that a lot of thought as well, and I think probably the longest we can go is probably a 4-year term. I think 6, as has been suggested previously, is too long to ask someone to commit to.
Just a second, Ms. Armijo. Let's just double check. So what I'm inferring or getting from Ms. Lippman's remarks is a board of 9, 4 expert opinions, prosecuting attorney, defense attorney, retired APD officer, and public policy professional or expert, and then 5 at-large members.
4-year staggered term.
And 4-year staggered term.
A prosecuting attorney,
Defense
public
attorney.
policy.
Right. Defense attorney. And a former police officer, not affiliated.
Oh, yeah, not APD, sorry.
Right.
Affiliated APD, and then
Or BSCO.
or
BCSO.
And then 5 at-large members.
Right.
So I believe the queue is Ms. Armijo, Mr. Wagner, Mr. Letty. We'll get around to everybody.
And a 4-year staggered term.
Yes, Ms. Armijo.
Okay, when you talk about a 4-year staggered term, you mean no more than 4 years?
No, they could be re-elected or reappointed,
Every
but
4 years?
the term is 4 years.
Okay,
And
and right
then-
now it's
3,
2 2-year terms, is that right?
2 3-year terms. 2 3-year terms.
Okay, because I've noticed some commissioners have been on for 6 years, and so then I mean, they haven't been following their own policy, but,
What would be your best take
4
on
years sounds fine, I'm
recommendation?
just curious why some commissioners have been there for 6 years.
But going forward, 2 4 years sounds
Yeah,
pretty
that's
good to
fine,
you?
that seems
Okay,
fine.
thank you.
I also, when I was reading the ordinance about the chairman not serving more than 1 term, is that right?
I don't know.
Not succeed himself.
But,
And I'm just suggesting that the chairman, I think they have an excellent chairman now, and it would be a shame to see him lose his position.
but going forward,
I like the 4-year thing, that's.
2 4-year terms,
Yeah, because they need more experience and,
got it. Mr. Wagner.
I don't like the requirements for expert positions. I think, and I had a different reason for the 60-hour thing. I think that degrees are overrated, and I don't care if somebody is on there with a BA or a BS or a law degree, and because they meet the other criteria and they're good, that's fine. I don't want to require anybody to have any of those. I think, and I think too many degrees is a real problem. Even if they're a minority, they'll dominate.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Letty, yes.
I kind of agree with what Mr. Wegman just said, but I want to put it in a different context. And the context is, for instance, the POC subcommittee also recommended that that the role of the board side of this new agency would have you know, almost exclusively a policy advisory role and be an appeals body for individual complaints, but they would not get into the specific complaints. So if that's one set of circumstances that the group here would like, then I don't think we need the attorneys. You know, the expertise become less important. The community representation becomes more important. Because in the new, if in fact this is going to be a new framework and a new structure, we then are, you know, basically leaving it up to them to figure out what their relative roles are, and the expertise can be secured through professional selection of staff. For instance, you know, an attorney for the agency could be hired rather than having that person sitting on the board.
Got it.
So that's where I'm at with it.
At-large members.
At-large members.
And I think the 3 task force members here are in a row, so this is very good.
In terms of terms, how long is the city council term? Is it
4 years.
4 years.
4 years staggered. 4 years staggered, okay.
Right, Mr. Brad?
And I always describe the idea, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I know they've been doing it 3 years, I just haven't heard a good valid reason to move from the current 3+3. That seems to be an adequate period of time. Again, I don't like change for the sake of change, and this is something that seems to be working.
Would you recommend term limits after 2 terms, or just 3-year terms?
Term limits are always good. The 3+3, I'm not sure if there are term limits now, but there should be term limits after 26.
Got it. Mr. Sorry.
And I was one of the members on the POC Secondary Task Force, and then was actively involved in these discussions about expertise with the experts on the POC. We felt that it was necessary to agree who those experts were. I don't know that there was necessarily consensus. Yeah, I had some issue with the prosecuting attorney, with the public policy, well, not necessarily public policy, I was with the defense attorney, because I think there were so many other attorneys out there. If we felt that attorney was absolutely necessary to provide that level of experience, you know, there's civil rights attorneys, there's, you know, if we're concerned about civil liability for the city and a whole number of other issues, we probably ought to have an attorney up there who's an expert in the civil defense, maybe, or a plaintiff's attorney. But we don't want to go down that road, and I want to be real careful that we don't overdo this whole expertise sort of thing. I like Fabrizio's idea that I think it's important that we have experts as part of the committee, whether it be the advisory board or otherwise, to advise on those legal issues or constitutional issues or employment issues that may come up. But we felt that was necessary.
Let me just clarify. I heard Mr. Berletti say that all of that expertise could be found in staff. Are you saying that also they should also reside, as the chairman was saying, in some of the members of the board?
That would be my recommendation, my understanding, is that we have the actual experts on the board, maybe serve as advisors. They may not be a non-voting member, but they are members of the board to provide that on-board expertise in various number of different situations.
Mr. Erickson is up next, if you don't mind.
I also don't think that there's a reason to name the kinds of expertise that we have on the commission. I think it should just be at-large members. I also think about whether certain stakeholders are involved in the process. I don't think that prosecutors or defense attorneys are stakeholders in the same sense that Andrew's talking about it. I think of stakeholders as being the police department, members of the community in general, the civil rights community in general. So when I last week when I was suggesting that certain stakeholders have a certain number of appointments to the body, that's what I was thinking about, having potentially some from the police department, some from the civil rights bar, some from the city council, and some from the mayor. That to me represents the stakeholder, people who actually are invested personally or politically in the process, and that's how I think we should think about where those people come from. I also think that takes care of some of the concerns about who these people are. If you have people from around the issue, they're all gonna invest their appointees with the things that they think are important into those appointees. But getting back to this, I think it should just be at-large members. I don't think it's worthwhile picking out certain types of expertise. I think it's absolutely correct to think that there are potentially types of lawyers that are even better suited to this than those ones, maybe in addition to those ones. But better just to leave it to elected officials who, if we keep it with the selection committee, are going to be the ones making the decision. They're the ones who are going to have to stand up and say, this is why we pick these people.
Let me just note, there are at least three paths here. One is at-large, leaving it up to the selection committee on the general criteria there for application. One is to have designated expertise positions to make sure that the board has that and doesn't rely completely on staff. Another is to have a different set of criteria along the lines of Mr. Erickson. I think you were saying that there are different groups in the community that might need to be represented either individually or in blocks. Something along the lines of what Mr. Siegel, I think, was going. These are sort of three different general directions, it seems to me. I'm just trying to catalog these as we go forward. Yeah, and then Mr. Wagner and Ms. Armijo.
Yeah, and if I can just clarify, what I'm suggesting is something along the lines of what Mr. Siegel said, was instead of having the selection committee, I'm saying that what I would prefer to see is those different stakeholders each appoint a certain number of commissioners, so that we had 3 plus 3 plus 3 potentially instead of the selection committee. So that's really the way I think that we should balance this rather than having the selection committee. The selection committee is what came out of the POC subcommittee.
Right.
That's sort of what's come to the forefront here as the default, but that's actually not my preference.
Got it. Ms. Wagner. And then Ms. Armijo and Mr. Waits.
Okay,
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr.
Okay.
Yes.
I would
Take it in
not-
any order you want.
I would not preclude an attorney from being on the agency board. But if you start requiring it, there's a possibility that for a number of them, you start looking, if the board is looking to the attorney or member for legal advice, you create a real conflict with the attorney. As soon as an attorney who's a member of a board begins giving legal advice to the board, then that attorney is functioning as the board's lawyer, and the attorney is then responsible for any decisions that might be contrary to law, or, and you need an outside, you want legal advice, get it from somebody outside. So there's a danger there. And on selection, I'm kind of agnostic, except that I think that I came into today thinking not even that the council should not even have a voice. I'm coming around to, I don't mind the council having a voice. I don't think the mayor should have a voice in selecting members of the oversight body, because the mayor has a voice and is part of the chain of command of the police department.
Okay, got it. I think Ms. Armijo, then the chair, and then Mr. Waits.
Well, I kind of agree with both of them. The mayor shouldn't have any input in selecting these members. And maybe we could do it where, the group picks 5 or 4, and the city council picks another 4 or 5, whatever. I do like it, it's a lot better.
Okay. Mr. Chairman.
The concern was to, and the reason we came up with this formula was to ensure that stakeholder groups were represented. And that's to avoid the problem either from the public saying they don't understand what the problem is, or the police department saying they don't understand what we do. So we tried to have stakeholders. If those are the wrong stakeholders, then that can be changed. The other way to achieve that is what's already been bounced out here, and that's in the composition of the selection committee. So it can either be the selection committee or giving the selection committee guidance to who should serve on the board. It can be done either way. I kind of feel leaning more towards giving the selection committee guidance on who should sit on the board, rather than trying to structure a selection committee that has the right representation to select the people. In other words, you want a board that's going to look at policies and procedures and so forth for the police department. So you want people on that board, not necessarily on a selection committee, on that board who are looking at those things, not just selecting the people who are looking at That's why I'm leaning in that direction. Now, we might want to change the two attorneys. The idea there was that those were stakeholders, so if that's wrong, then.
It doesn't hurt to have people who have experience with
Oh.
public policy.
And the other thing I wanted to say was, I've had many attorneys serve on many boards, and they all know when they're serving on that board, they're not giving legal advice. That's not why they're there. They're not there to give legal advice, but give a perspective as a stakeholder.
Okay. Mr. Waits?
I think Hans kind of captured what I was, and so I really don't have any other comment.
But if you could reiterate, it might be helpful, because I think this is actually very important, and yet it's a little murky as to which is the better way to go. So the rationale, I think, really matters. If you could
Well,
articulate that.
personally, my personal opinion is that stakeholders should be the majority body of that group. And having a lawyer, I mean, I can almost eliminate lawyers as far as I'm concerned.
There's several around the table.
I have no problem with that.
He's using that figuratively, by the way.
Not figuratively.
We preached him before he got in there.
But, you know, I know, and I said this last week, when you get a group of lawyers, you're gonna get a lawyer's opinion. Or, you know, you have a policeman, you're gonna have a police opinion. So I think you should have those people, but not as a larger number as stated up here. Does that make sense?
Well, there have been,
Okay, 5.
so are you proposing that there should be some, for lack of a better term, expert position?
You have to have those people.
On the board.
I agree with that. You have to have those people, but maybe not at that.
But can that be, as I think I was inferring from Mr. Burley, Mr. Wagman, and others, that can be done by a selection committee looking at the range of people, but rather than having specific positions.
Exactly.
However, Mr. Lippman and Mr. Correa are saying it's really important to designate, otherwise it's a little nebulous and it leaves it up to chance a little bit. I'm trying to just articulate what I understand.
I think you just nailed it right.
Okay, and then Mr. Erickson, you've actually introduced a whole different point of view, which is, let's go back and not have a selection committee, but have certain designated community groups or coalitions just select internally their own people to sit on.
Yes.
Okay, that's an entirely, it is, just to say, it's an entirely different selection process. Okay. So, we were chugging along. Yeah, this is actually very important, though. I don't mean to make light of it, I'm sorry.
I want to point out that the process that has been proposed here, that seems to be the default of the selection committee, is an awful lot like the current selection committee, except that it's not a one-to-one. It's still just the city council. It's a majority of the city council that's going to select those people. It isn't a very big change in terms of changing the people in the city government and the police department and the community who are involved in picking those people. It's pretty much the same counselors. Not everyone's satisfied with the way the council selects those people. So I think we can go a little bit further away from what the current process is and still have it be relatively stable.
I would respectfully disagree. It's very different. The current process has each counselor recommending 2 positions, and then the mayor selects from among those 2 positions. So every counselor is recommending somebody from their district, and they're recommending 2 people. And then the final decision is with the mayor. If what we're saying is 5 people, not 9, but 5 people, and the city council selects that group that's going to be doing the selecting. That's very different than them selecting 18 people and the mayor picking the people to serve on it. It's a very different case.
I acknowledge that it is different.
Okay.
Are there,
Well, I thought you said it was too much to say. So.
at this point, we really don't even have 2 alternatives to choose between. So I would think that we need to have further discussion to try to elucidate this just a little more, Mr. Lloyd and Mr. Wagner?
No, one of the alternatives, I really like the mayor point three, the council point three, and at-large groups point three. And my reason for thinking that way is the council and the mayor, I mean, at-large groups are gonna represent a small group, very small group. The council, the whole nine represent the entire city of Albuquerque. The mayor represents the entire city of Albuquerque. And we can look at decisions made by the council, and recently the mayor a few months ago, and decisions were made based on what the community thoughts were. So I think that by having the mayor make the three, the council make the three, you've got 9 councilors that got to agree with the three. That could be entertaining in itself. But I think the mere fact, the fact that they represent the entire city of Albuquerque, not just smaller groups, makes sense. But you also still have that community involvement, but it's going to be a small community involvement when you've got 3 at-large groups doing it. But I like the 3, 3, and 3. At first I thought 7 members was plenty, but 9 seemed to make sense.
Okay. Mr. Wagner, I think you wanted to,
Yeah, in an attempt to maybe get something down and move on. Perhaps we could put 2 alternatives and say we couldn't decide which, and both of them would be, one would be.
which would those be?
One would be, and this would not preclude a selection committee, but the council will determine how, and have the final say on who is selected, except that it shall not be each council member, they will be at-large selections, and it will not be each council member putting forward somebody from his or her own district. Or it will be, the mayor and the council will somehow, it could be 3, 3, 3, or I mean, the disagreement seems to be it's all council, or you let the mayor have a say.
No,
Well, I don't know, Mr. Lloyd wants to let the mayor have a say, pursuant to Mr. Siegel's suggestion. So I don't know if we want to include that as an option, but I think we can put something very vague and without specifying how the council picks it, other than we don't want to see one person from each councilor, but the council does it.
Just a second, if I may, I think it might, just as an outsider, might be helpful to at least say what your intent is if the mechanism cannot be.
My intent is to have them selected however the council chooses, except that it not be each council member picking one person, and that the mayor have no say. That's my intent.
Got it. Mr.
My intent is to have it as independent as possible, and at the same time, have it be viewed by, for lack of a better term, stakeholders as being a competent group of people. The narrowing down of the selection committee to 5 members, like you were saying 3, they could argue about 3. Well, 5 is less than 9 as well. So the city council would have to agree on who those 5 are. In terms of making sure that the public feels represented, that the stakeholders feel represented, et cetera, as I said before, one approach could be you have the stakeholders comprise the selection committee. And I think that is fraught with many, many challenges and problems. Who are the groups that you select to do it, et cetera, et cetera. If we instead, kind of like the way this task force was formed, give some guidance to the selection committee. We want people who represent stakeholder groups. Here's 4 positions, the other 5 can come from the community at large. And leave it to the wisdom of the council to put the right people on that selection committee, and then the wisdom of that selection committee to pick the right 9 people with some guidance that some of those should be experts so that we have a competent board.
Technically competent.
Yes.
They have some. My
We're
inference would be
increasing the
that
training too,
even
which
if
will
you-
bring everybody up to speed, but at least you have some expertise there to
President.
start with.
All right, well, there's the latest idea, which is the original one that Mr. Lippman, the chair of.
I just explained my reasoning.
Okay, what I've heard so far is that, except for Mr. Erickson and Mr. Roy, the idea of a selection committee might be a useful one, and that might be one thing to figure out whether there's general agreement on, we can go on it later. The other one is, when you have some guidance for diverse representation, background, skills, that kind of thing. How specific you want to get on that, I don't know. And then there's the idea of whether you say there should be some technical expertise on the board, or that there are specific positions reserved for those folks is another issue. Yes?
I would be happy with just a general statement that says at large on the board itself. That they should be at large. Either this special selection committee, but not specify, not to exclude anybody, but not specify specific expertise that should be included in the board, and keep it sort of real general.
Are you saying consider this breadth of expertise, or not even say that?
No, not even say that. I'm just saying, leave it out, this is an at large. I think we need to take it out of the districts. Now, 7 or 9, I like smaller, but I'm not, sanguine about it. But it just seems, from my experience, it works better if you have less number of people, but 9 is a logical number. I can't really argue. Beyond that, if you go to 11 or 13, I would really have a problem. But 7 or 9, I'm okay with that. But keep it general, and let the council figure out. We could make a general statement about representation on the board from key segments of the community, or broad representation from the community, or some such, which we've got lots of language that we can pick from different committees on that. Some general statement like that. The more general, the better.
Okay. At large?
At large is important.
I have to say, I'm hearing more 9 comments than 7 comments. And, or 9 with mostly at large, but with some positions designated. Mr. Chairman, I think it's back over to you.
Okay. Maybe we can narrow this down to those 2 recommendations. I actually would be fine with either of those. That is, to amplify it, 9 with 4 positions or some number of positions designated as expertise, but more than the majority being at-large positions, or a smaller number, 7. If we're going to do all at-large positions, you can shrink it down. 7, but with fairly specific guidance. In other words, give them guidance, but more specific than what Mr. Bertoletti is suggesting, and along the lines of what we're talking about in terms of, if you want to look at it that way, specific positions. In other words, the 5-person selection committee should have an eye towards filling those 7 members of the board with stakeholders. Examples being, again, if these are the wrong terms, but
examples being
right, those.
Okay.
And I would add to that, community organizations.
I didn't understand these to be non-voting members.
No, they're not. They're voting members.
They would be voting members.
I don't know where that got there.
Somebody
That could be
mentioned that.
withdrawn. That would
Oh,
just be-
I'm
they could
sorry,
withdraw.
sorry.
That's okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
But
take out the non-voting.
the 4 expert positions, 5 at large,
Take it.
or the alternative at this point is all at large with some guidance as to making sure that there's a range of professional and experiential background.
Technical expertise in the field of public safety. Well, as far as the experts are concerned, it could be attorneys, it could be many other positions, agents, whatever.
I am
thinking that we better move on from here. We've got a couple of more things to deal with, including the suggested preamble, et cetera, language. But Ms. Kingsford, were you going to say anything?
Even though I was on the, it seems like I'm undoing everything that I did on the POC subcommittee, but, well, that's not. I'm uncomfortable.
Just a second. Sorry, is there a technical question? Just, Nancy's saying she's going back on everything she did in the subcommittee report.
Yes,
So-
like my brother said, maybe I'm too open-minded, everything falls out, but, I'm uncomfortable with the designation.
The designation of these
right.
things.
The reason, yeah, I'm uncomfortable, it's kind of like the criteria back to, how many, if we're saying, well, you don't need 60 credit hours, it appears to be an elitist organization, which is exactly the opposite of what it is that the community has been talking about. Now, it may be that folks self-select in terms of who applies, and then so be it. However, if this is going to be truly community oversight or civilian oversight, then I believe we should have it be at large, and people who apply will come to it with an interest and an expertise, either from their own personal experience or some background. And it may be, mine is, mental health, and I happen to be a lawyer who's done that, so I put myself forward for this, and I expect the public will do that as well. So I vote against expert positions, and have them all be at large and have it be 9 people.
So at this point, what I'm getting is that there are some fairly cogent arguments for having 9, looks like 9, all at-large community positions, with the reasoning you just mentioned, that people will self-select, and if there's guidance that, as Mr. Prey was saying, that as long as there's a range of professional technical background as well as community experience. The other argument is that this is very important work, and we need to have specifically some people with some specific expertise on that board. So, Mr. Berletti, Ms. Armijo.
I agree with this new proposal. I would not like to see those first things. 9 is fine. At large, keep it in mind that, again, if this is going to be part of a new structure that has some decent budget set aside to be able to hire expertise, they can do it. They can decide what expertise they need specifically, that they don't need to be necessarily on the board side of that. And going back again to the notion that the POC subcommittee came up with, which I support, was that the board size should be policy oriented and function as an appeals board, but not get into the weeds in terms of specific complaints. They should have, however, lots of information that informs policy.
So I think we've got the two basic, there's a third one as well, the 2 that I've heard most comments on, ideas out there. Ms. Armijo, anything else
I
before
guess
we
I'm
go
just trying
on?
to find out, where are we here? Is that it, the first?
No,
board
we
that
have,
consists of 9 at-large members who collectively have a broad range of skills, background, and experience, and that's it?
and then there is a subsequent, maybe, here's what I suggest. Could you make that number 10? That number 9, we'll just leave it at 9, and number 10 be the board members or the COA members will be, and there are 2 alternatives, either selected at large from the community. The other alternative is having 4 of the positions should be a specific, have some specific technical or professional background.
and the other 5 would be at large.
What happens when you don't get a former police officer applying for the job, or a prosecuting attorney, or a public policy, what happens then?
Well, first of all, I think that you would, but if you didn't, then you just wouldn't have that position. It would stay open until you could identify someone.
And maybe specify to in the field of public safety.
Yeah.
So
Oh.
It's 5 that are at
expertise in
large.
the field of public safety. That's really very, very broad.
So the one at large, Mr. Perea is saying, there'd be community at large, but there would be a range of expertise or background in the area of public safety.
He has technical
With
expertise
technical-
in the field of public safety.
That there'd be a representation on that at-large board.
From someone who has
Thank you.
expertise, technical
From
expertise.
people who have technical expertise in the field of public safety. Yes, Mr. White.
Is there any disagreement with a statement, I don't know if we're gonna come to agreement on any of this, but is there any disagreement with a statement that however the members of the body are selected, it shall not be one council member, one position, that it should be the council at large and not individual council members doing it? I mean, if we can agree on that, I think we should put it in there, because it's probably, we might not reach an agreement on anything else, but I think we want to say.
Well, if we stick with 9, I think that's necessary to put in there.
Yeah, there's a danger that
Yeah.
we'll come up with 9, and
Yeah,
so I
exactly.
think just independently put in
will
there,
not
however they're selected, it
correspond
shall not be
necessarily to
individual
council
selections by individual council members.
Well, I wouldn't go along with the however selected, but the will not correspond to city council is good. If you're gonna stick with 9, then we should say that it's
Well,
not based on districts.
That, it could actually,
Well,
will
not selected individually by council members.
And will not be, just say will not be, but will not be selected individually by council.
By council members, because the council.
Well, wait a minute, aren't we having a committee doing the selecting?
I don't know. I don't know, did we agree?
Okay, if we
on
have a
that?
committee, then you don't need to say that.
We didn't agree, we haven't agreed. So what I'm saying is whatever we do, if you stick that language in there, it precludes that option, which is what, the one thing
Right.
nobody wants.
Okay, so it may
That's
be,
the way it is.
if you do agree to it, then it may be redundant at this point. So if I may, can we move on to number 10? Now, this is a really rich discussion, and we've got a couple more things to do. So let me just read it and say all civilian oversight agency board members will complete a specific training program which may consist of, and the intent from staff's point of view was to say, these seem to be the ones that were suggested by the board, but they're not necessarily meant to be mandated nor exclusive. So anyway, comments or improvements? Yes, please.
I would change may to should, and I would, should or shall, would make it stronger. And I didn't bring my binder, but the MGT report made specific suggestions about what the training should be, and I believe this should just track the recommendation from MGT.
Should we say other recommendations as noted in the MGT?
I think staff can
Just lift it.
check the recommendations and fill that in.
All right, there's the recommendation for using the MGT study to put any additional.
I have the MGT study, if you wanna look at it and see what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Let's reference it and move on.
Yeah. That's what step.
Unless people have.
I do, I have specific things.
You have others, yes, Mr. Chairman.
Item D, attendance at national conferences and workshops. I think we should specify the annual NACOL conference. It's the only professional organization, it's specific to civilian oversight. And what I'm trying to avoid is if you say, they have to go to 3 workshops and the board member picks the 3 workshops, they could pick whatever they wanted to pick, and it may or may not be germane, it may not be the best thing to go to. The NACOL conference is specifically for that.
Mr. Brea and then Mr. Burley.
I agree that D is a little bit vague, and we have to specify that we have no control over that conference. I don't know how long it's been running, or how long it's guaranteed to run in the future, and I think if we make that part of the, if it becomes part of the ordinance, then running the problem down the road, if for some reason beyond anyone's control.
I would just leave it general that we attend conferences and workshops as, you know.
Relating to,
Relating to
police oversight.
Yeah, of course.
Mr. Erickson and then Mr.
I agree with that. I don't know if it's always this way, but this year, the NACOL conference was like Sunday through Thursday. And to require that even every other year, if we're assuming that the council, the commissioners are gonna spend 20 to 40 hours a month on this, and then also have to take a week off work, it's pretty burdensome. There seems like there should at least be a way to satisfy the training requirements that doesn't make you have to go to the conference, if it is as lengthy as it was this year.
Okay. Mr. Wagner?
Except, you know,
Okay. So the idea.
Had a job. That's
I
what
know,
the
I'm
commission's
just
gonna
saying,
have.
So the NACOL conference is a model and a standard.
Yes,
And signaling it there shows the real seriousness of the intent of the task force. However, other comments say you can't guarantee the future, it should be in the ordinance, and it may be burdensome to put it in there. So,
since I brought it up, I'll accept a compromise. Just language like relating to or including, like you had it, doesn't say that you have to, it just
Such as.
somehow recommending, such as, yeah, something words to that effect. I think we should mention the NACOL conference. Having attended it, I would push for that one. I recognize that there are others. There are no others that I'm aware of that specifically deal with citizen oversight. There may be other law enforcement conferences, et cetera. Anyway, I
anybody
think we should
object to
name
just
it.
name it without requiring it?
Yeah, I do.
If somebody on the POC had told me about it, I wouldn't have known.
Yeah, I mean, I object to the same for what Mr. Erickson said. We're conscientiously making it so community members without high education degrees and presumably with lower levels of income and who have jobs that really put really strong constraints on the amount of free time they have, so we can get them on this body, and then telling them they have to take time off from work which their employer may not let them take. I think you can put in there, you know, separately, people there that members are encouraged to go to any of these that they can. But to put it into the list of things that they shall, I think it's not right. I think that we should provide sufficient shall training.
Shall consist of
without having to go to that.
civilian academy, civil rights, specific number of APT ride-alongs, encouraged, members will be encouraged to attend.
I think you'd say all board members are encouraged to, but
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Like I
Not,
said, I'm
not
okay
in the
with
list
that.
of, not in the list of a sentence that begins shall.
So we'd have this list, and then underneath it, additionally, members are encouraged to attend national workshops, conferences and workshops relating
At
to
city,
police oversight.
and I think it also has to say at city expense.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I think you gotta say in there at city expense.
So
Right.
would that be a new number?
So it would be a non-numbered one. It would be, because it's unrelated to the shall.
I think you could, I think you take it out to the left margin and put it in parentheses. Might make sense.
That would be one way to do it. Are encouraged to attend national conferences and workshops related to police
No, no.
oversight.
No?
You can leave the attendance at conferences and workshops and just say, board members are encouraged to attend the NACOL conference.
As soon as you say national, that's guaranteeing somebody has to take off work, you know, a couple of days.
Right, it's just
fly some-
encouraging them.
Right, but it's under the,
No, it's not. They
What-
moved it.
What I'm hearing, the two things are, the chair is saying, is recommending that part of the training program is making sure that people can go at city expense to the NACOL conference or other things like that. Other people are saying that's pretty onerous from a workload perspective, and it should just be separate, it should be unconnected to the shall consist of. And just say, and additionally, they are encouraged to attend national
Or
workshops.
one option would be this conference.
it
And
says
such as. Okay, this is Armijo.
I hate to throw this in, but I'm going to anyway. That is not training. Training is developing a job analysis and then developing training that meets, that actually addresses the skills identified in that job analysis. So that's not really training.
You actually can get training credits.
Huh?
You can get training credits attending the conference.
Well,
It's
maybe It's
recognized.
not training, it's not considered actual
Okay.
training.
However, does,
If you're a
does,
training person, you know what training is. But my point is, the things we haven't talked about is them even attending a PLC meeting, you know, reading policies and procedures, which,
so what additionally would you put in?
well, I think it was good for us to attend a PLC meeting. I don't know how many of you went, but it was really a good experience. And that should be filled in, that they attend a PLC meeting before.
This is the
and
PLC.
that-
This is the board itself.
I know that, but I'm saying
She's saying before they apply, they
That's
need
right,
to go.
not even before they apply, if they're selected, this is a training they get afterwards. That they attend a POC meeting so that they understand how it works, and that they have an insight to how the IRO works, and read policies and procedures, you know.
It's eye-opening, they're not gonna get it.
Just a second, let,
I'm just saying that there's a lot of things lacking there that go into training.
so we, at this point, what would you recommend putting in there, or at least alerting the report writers and the city council?
I think going to a POC meeting, attending a couple of POC meetings, understanding how the IRO works, kind of basic skills before you get there, before you sit there and start making decisions, you've got a little bit of an insight as to what the rule requires.
Now, this
And
is,
I don't see that.
at this point, if we were to go back to, it's number 2, if the board, if the task force makes the official decision, there seems to be an emerging agreement that an entirely different board would be put together, selected by this selection committee,
Right.
so forth. So there wouldn't be a POC anymore.
You don't have to call it a POC, whatever it is.
They have to attend the meetings
They would have to attend a meeting.
before assuming
Right.
office.
They get some hands-on experience. I
So-
mean, not hands-on, but.
Attendance, there you go.
I mean,
There you
not-
go. Ms. Kingsbury, and then Ms.
in the current city ordinance, there's this, attend a yearly firearms training simulator.
Oh, I was gonna bring.
And I think that needs to be on the list of required.
Annual firearms
Yeah, the
training.
FATS, yeah,
FATS.
FATS training.
Annual FATS training.
It's actually, it's required now.
Okay.
So
Also.
I'm glad you added that, I was gonna add it.
Anything else?
And reading policies and procedures
Um,
that apply to the IRO, the POC, and maybe the APD.
Okay, so another one under H was recommended is familiarity with
Yeah.
all board, APD and oversight
Policies and procedures.
policies and procedures.
Now, going back to G,
Okay?
attendance at a board, now they could see these on government television. You wouldn't have to be there in order to observe the POC meeting. Would that be acceptable, to observe the board meeting before appointment?
Just say observe.
Right, as opposed to attend, because there are a lot of different ways to.
Observe a board meeting before appointment.
And is it just one board meeting? Is that what we
I don't know,
are suggesting?
I
At
don't know how
least
this
one
would be
board,
standard.
at least one
At
board.
least they should see how it works, all right?
If you leave it to observe, me, it's too loose.
And that's not a
Yeah, I
training.
watched last week's.
Training is,
Oh, I
training
forget.
is, training is what happens after you're on.
Right,
That's right.
right.
It's not a prerequisite.
That's right. It's not before you're appointed, but after,
Right.
just attend the board meeting.
Should go right here, maybe?
Okay, but you will already be on the board, so you'll be
Yeah, if
attending.
you're selected, and you just go through this training.
So, but where, I think where she's suggesting has to be somewhere back in the qualifications, have attended or.
Oh, that's, yes, for qualifications.
No, I'm saying
No,
that
she's
after
saying
they're
after
selected.
you're selected, this is part of the training, you got to go to a
When
meeting.
you're selected, you have to go to the meeting.
I'm
No,
just
no,
explaining
no.
what she's saying.
Sorry, Ms.
Guys.
Amino, could you try that again? Because I think there's some confusion that if you are already
So
appointed.
we're assuming we just start this all fresh. Is that what we're thinking here?
Yeah.
And
Well-
at no time have they gone to a previous PLC meeting so that they, because we're not gonna dissolve the PLC and start fresh, are we?
No,
We're gonna.
Yeah, probably.
We're gonna go into this?
No, that'll probably dissolve.
second-
Okay, well, after you pick your original people, you're gonna have another set come in, and they should be observing a board meeting. They should.
They're the board.
In fact, if you're gonna train them, you have to test them, that's how
Well,
training
no,
works.
if you have, for example, if you have, that'll be true of the first board will not be able to do that. But if you have staggered terms, subsequent appointees could be asked to go attend a meeting before they are seated.
So that they get an insight, because
That's
if we're
what
gonna
she
take a
said.
lot of people, you go out in
So
public,
you've
they don't
been
know what the
selected,
PLC
you
is.
attend the board
Did
meeting.
any of us?
Excuse me, let me
Yeah,
just try.
that's what she's saying. It's part of the training. You
So
have to.
part of the training, say, Mr. Loy is selected. He is appointed. He's gonna be going to meetings
Eventually,
anyway.
yeah. Eventually, but he shouldn't even start going to meetings till he's familiar with policies, procedures, and how
There
the
we
board
go.
works.
So there's a probationary or training period between appointment and full seating.
Yes, I think so.
I think that's what
Some sort of
Ms.
training.
Armijo is saying.
All right,
Like I
so
said,
then,
that's not
then,
training.
That's a different
there's three
training.
stages. There's requirements to be selected. There's requirements that have to be fulfilled after you're selected and before you take a position with a vote. And then there's ongoing training once you're on.
Right.
I think that's what's being.
Right, but I'm saying, if we're gonna do that, we have to have three separate sections. It can't, I don't think it goes under 11, you have to have it divided out and make clear that where it's being typed in now is,
So between the time one is, okay, so this is now, the new number 11 is A becomes 11. And there will be, the recommendation is, there will be some, that was my term, I don't know if it's correct, probationary period or orientation period.
upon selection and before
Upon
assuming.
selection
Before
before
assuming a place on the board.
sitting, there'll be an orientation.
And before.
Well, that can be broken up.
Right.
A probationary period, I don't know, a probationary.
Not probationary, I don't think
period
that's
implies
right.
Yeah.
That's not right. Orientation
Right.
period.
Remember,
Orientation and training.
no, leave the word training out, keep the training as part of it.
Right.
Complete an orientation
Orientation,
program.
there we go. That sounds better.
Complete an orientation program.
Which
Takes me
consists of
back
the
to
following.
my freshman orientation.
Well, that's all it is.
Consisting of the following.
Consisting of attendance at board meetings, familiarity with agency policies and procedures,
Becoming familiar,
and becoming familiar.
attending a board meeting.
All right. Yes, Mr. Chairman, because I'm gonna,
Okay, I wanted to add, we'll be at 13 now. I think there should be a,
becoming familiar.
a penalty, a criteria, a sanction, that's the word I was looking for. A sanction if you don't do this, so I think we should add another, like I said, 13, I guess. Commission members or board members who do not complete all required training, failure to do so may result in dismissal, however we want to say that. But there should be a sanction. You must go, you must do the training. And there has to be a way to track it and a sanction for not doing it.
Okay, so a recommendation for number 13 is if board members do not complete or something.
I think it's a failure to complete orientation will result in not being seated. Failure to complete training
Can result in dismissal.
Can result in dismissal.
That's fine.
Who does the dismissing?
Well, the committee does, but city council could.
The board as a quasi-independent, the board could do it.
They can do it themselves, that's right.
I think you want to keep the council out of it.
Tim, do you
Yeah,
just
probably.
Jessica has a question.
Can I just make a quick comment that's kind of interesting about what you all are talking about? When we had a vacancy, when Bambi Folk left the POC board, Councilor Winter had 2 members come forward saying that they were interested, and he recommended that they both attend a POC meeting prior to even applying, and both went, and one dropped out and didn't even apply. So I don't know if, just for your all sake, if maybe that's something that they do just prior to applying.
Well, so you're
Just a
supporting
thought.
that concept, that's
Yeah,
good.
that's just a support.
It just supports it.
But Jessica's
So-
saying to back it
No,
up.
back it up and put it before the selection.
Because we did have somebody drop out, they didn't want to be a part of that.
So here it is, failure to complete the
We're not
orientation.
gonna have any applicants.
Yeah, right.
Or orientation is to be completed before city.
No,
Two separate
two different things.
Okay.
They might be put in the same one, but if you don't complete the orientation program, you won't become a board member.
Right.
If you don't complete the training program after becoming board member, you may be
You may be subject
liable.
to.
You may be
Yeah,
subject.
I don't think you want to say complete, you want to say comply, just the training program is
Comply.
ongoing,
Right.
it's never complete. You can check out, you can never leave.
I think if we can, I'd like to say, let's go to the submitted recommendation for preamble and
Ooh,
summary. Is there anything else on this, Mr.
Yeah,
Chairman?
I have-
Well, in that case, let's keep going.
okay, all right. I had a few things. Well, let me start, since we're still kind of talking about the board, et cetera. We have not resolved the issue of a stipend for the board members, and I think that is very critical. We're asking them to serve for 4 years, we're making all these requirements, they gotta do all these training, et cetera, et cetera. I think they should have some kind of compensation. That also helps with the broad spectrum of people that we wanna get.
Just a second, this is may result.
Yeah.
And then where would you suggest that stipend be put in? Can it be included in one of the upper ones?
It could be, yeah, you could include it in the part where we're describing who the board members are,
Under number 9?
under number 9,
Nine
yeah,
and
could
10.
go there. You just add another bullet point or whatever, board members will be compensated by the budget. Or it could be, didn't we have a budget thing somewhere?
Oh, yeah, that could be under the budget.
Could be under the budget thing.
That would be as present under number 3, and B, or not. B could be.
Yeah,
the
that's a big good place to put it.
That all agency board members will receive a stipend and compensation. Mr. Berlin.
I would, I thought about that issue at one point, I actually included it in one of my write-ups, but the more I think about it, it's probably not. I would object to that notion of stipends because, first of all, it would be the only board or commission associated with city government that would actually have a stipend. there are boards that are intense, like the Environmental Planning Commission, for instance. They don't get compensated. And so I think that might be viewed as sort of a real exception, and it actually may hurt the funding issue at a political level. So I would encourage the elimination of that notion.
Are there other comments on this? Ms. Moran?
We seem to be asking this particular board, POC, the new board, to take on a lot of area. Not that these other boards and commissions
You
don't
speak
have
up just a little bit
Not
more.
that these boards and commissions don't have, important goals and responsibilities that they conduct. But this is, again, something that is incredibly high profile. It's something that I think the city constituencies, the citizens out there demanded. And again, we are piling a lot of work on this group of individuals and demanding a lot of hours. And I'm not sure how many hours some of these boards and commissions put in, but we're talking a considerable number of hours above and beyond. I think what normal meet once a month, maybe sort of board might do.
Okay. Mr. Wagner, Mr. Wood?
I agree. I think we're asking for an awful lot of work. I do think we need to compensate it, and if it creates an issue with other boards, well, that's for the council to decide.
Yeah,
And-
maybe we should compensate them too.
And there have been things that I have had in my head that I have chosen not to say because I thought I couldn't get it past all of you, but I've tried not to let what I thought I could get past the city council and not to restrict what I said. I think we recommend, if the council shoots it down, the council shoots it down.
Yeah.
Mr. Wood?
I think to have one board within the city of the numerous boards that we have receiving compensation just sends a bad message. I think we're gonna send a message to all the other boards, you're just not really that important.
Any other opinions? Mr. Erickson?
I'm a little bit concerned that it would be the only one also, but I also think that if that is the case, then they probably would just reject that recommendation. So it would be nice, maybe suggest to the council that, sorry, Steph, do you want to interject here?
Go ahead.
That this could be a suggestion that when somebody serves on a board like this, they should, if there's a feeling that they should be compensated, and they could probably still reject it, but think about it in the
Is
future.
there a staff knowledge that is pertinent?
Yeah, I just want to point out that if a board member receives some type of stipend or compensation, they would have to be considered city employees for the purpose of getting paid. So that might create a conflict.
Is that the case, even if it's an independent board like this?
We don't have any independent boards that get stipends, so I would guess that if someone was to receive a paycheck, let's say. they
Not a
would have to-
paycheck.
then
It
they
could
would-
be called a stipend, a per diem.
Then they would be considered contractors of the city.
As long as it's paid by the city, that's a paycheck.
But anyway, there's some HR type legal issues that would have to be considered. I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on all those, but that's something to consider.
We might review that issue.
We could put that in, as if possible,
Yeah.
we recommend, stipend. I think we should
That's
also stipulate that no benefits.
So, latest suggestion, kind of a compromise. So should we put it under the budget one, number 3, and 3B?
Yeah, that's.
Say, if
that's
possible,
acceptable.
board members of the new citizen oversight agency would receive, you've got it in there, see stipend, although they're not receiving, okay, got it. Are there other comments that, or other recommendations that we need to, Ms. Kingsburg and then back to the chair?
On the list from last time for next week.
Yes.
We've actually taken care of the uniform qualifications and the composition. We have yet to address the supervision and if there's any direction about allocating work between the amount of systemic issues and the individual cases.
If I may, and I hope to not be speaking out of turn, but this was the intent from the staff position. The idea was if this quasi-public agency would then, by supervising its own personnel, we thought that handled that. The other thing was, under numbers 5, either 5, but 4, 5, and 6, if we say something about that's the primary function, to talk about policy, training, programs, and
procedures, I don't know whether, if the task force's pleasure, does that in effect handle the concern about systemic issues?
I'm trying to see
But
what.
I'll leave it up to your determination. But if we, under number 5, say, that the city and oversight agency as its principal function will have authority to recommend, but I'll leave it to your deliberation. Mr. Chairman.
Well, that is what we had discussed in the, because I had concerns about that too. So in the management subcommittee, we talked about that very thing, that we needed to, at this meeting, figure out that balance that we've been talking about between looking at individual cases and systemic policy kinds of issues. And we felt that it was covered in the language that we've created here, the recommendations, and that fine tuning could be left to the board itself as they see fit over time. But there's sufficient authority and information flow there to do both those things.
That doesn't work.
Yeah,
I
if
think
that doesn't work.
Do you have a recommendation, or how would you like to talk about the systemic issues?
Right, I appreciate that, because it seemed to me we had totally left it out, so I didn't get the implications.
Look at,
may I finish?
Yeah, hold on just a second, Mr. Lippman.
So it seems to me, if we're saying in number 5, that that the oversight agency has as a principal function, you know, the system stuff, but it's interesting that the subpart then goes directly to what would happen based on having, you know, essentially hearing the complaints, and so it's a total disconnect, it's really not a subset.
Okay.
So I think we do need to have some discussion there to fill that out. And at the moment,
Okay, so we'll come back to that. And just a second, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Wagner, and then back to the chair.
I would like to take out, as its principal function, and then, before we're done on another issue, I'd like to go back, and we don't have to worry now, but before we close this meeting, I want to go back to the issue of the language about supervising and some staff. I have a concern about that.
Okay, okay, so that does, so, let's go through, we've got a couple of things. One is, if the issues from last week have not adequately been handled, let's hold on that for just a second. And are there any other any comments on the draft recommendations? We were on number 13 at this point. 12 or 13, or these down here. And I think, Mr. Chairman, you had a couple more comments directly related, or am I guessing wrong?
Well, we're kind of in several different areas here. I'm going to leave alone the individual versus the systemic things, but I agree with Mr. Wagman. I wouldn't say principal, because I think we need to leave some discretion there. 5 and 6 cover those broad areas, because 6 relates to individuals. The Civilian Oversight Agency will have greater access to civilian complaints, court complaints, and internal affairs case data. This will allow greater analysis and understanding of trend data to support recommended policy changes. So it does mention complaints, individual complaints there. The other thing I wanted to bring up we haven't dealt with tonight is subpoena power. We talked about it, but we hadn't dealt with it.
Right.
So I want to throw it back on the table.
Well, hold on, first, Steph, if you could take out, as its principal function, it seems like it's, for a couple of reasons, it didn't seem like it worked very well. But that leaves us with a discussion about systemic issues and about supervision and about subpoena. I'm open for any. Where would you like to go first?
Supervision.
So this goes back to 2B or C at this point.
Okay, my concern is this, and I will ask the opinion of the other members of the task force.
Sorry.
We have the experience of city staff.
I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm talking about
Sorry about that.
right here.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr.
Okay, we have the experience of city staff, in my opinion, bending way over to create a division in the current police oversight mechanism to say that the IRO is one thing and the Police Oversight Commission is another and the IRO answers to somebody other. My question is that section there explicit enough that whoever, we won't even, without even calling it IRO, that whoever is performing that function is in fact personnel of the oversight body and being supervised by the oversight body, because we already know what effort is, that there is going to be an effort to split it apart, and I think it's our intent that it not be split. So I want to make sure that language is sufficiently explicit to express our intent.
So are you suggesting adding a sentence to that, to recommendation 2B? As it's now enumerated?
I'm looking for suggestions.
So the suggestion would be personnel
Instead of personnel, it's its own staff.
its own staff.
Because staff is mentioned in the previous sentence,
Okay.
including any staff carrying out the functions currently performed by the IRO.
So the recommendation is including the functions currently
Carried out by the, instead of saying, by the independent review officer and the independent review office.
That's very explicit.
Yeah.
Mr. Bertoletti.
Well, if in fact this group is going to recommend the structural change, this is an agency, and I think it would be, we ought to leave it up to that agency and that board, new people, to figure out what the relationship. Ultimately, the city council is going, this is still talking about public money and public functions to a degree. We're trying to make it more independent than it is now, but it's still gonna be within, the realm of city government, if you will. So, I think that we ought to allow that flexibility to the new group to actually figure out how that's gonna work for themselves in a new agency.
I agree with Mr. Bertoletti. I think that the new board will decide what staff it needs. They may not even want an IRO. I think they probably will, but I think we should leave it to them because we are, in effect, creating a new agency. I also think the simpler the better. I think part of the problem with the current ordinance, it was ambiguous. If you say, leave it simple, the agency will administer its own budget and supervise its own staff, personnel, however you want to call it, period. It's black and white. I think it makes it clear, and you can't monkey with it. You can't say that they have to report to somebody else if they're the ones who are, it says right there.
If we adopt a preamble, then I'm comfortable with it.
Okay, the other thing I was gonna say is, we're not writing the ordinance. So we can't get too specific in things anyway, we're giving recommendations.
I'm just trying to make it real clear.
I know,
for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so does this handle the supervision question?
Yeah.
I think so.
All right.
Now, the idea of systems, the systems thing, sorry, that's a very precise systems thing. Systemic
We all know what
issue
you're doing.
focus. What comments do we need to exchange on that? You look troubled.
Yeah, I'm
Nancy.
still, just before we leave.
This is, we're talking this one here?
All oversight functions.
Okay, earlier, there were some recommendations on adding or changing this idea that the language about what, to be explicit, that the functions of the oversight process, as they are now structured, would be included in this new oversight agency. And that's what this was attempting
Yeah, and,
to do.
right, and I appreciate that. I'm thinking, I want, let's see. All right,
We have
I
to
got
say that
it.
again.
I got it.
Didn't we say that earlier?
We do, we're good.
Good.
I can't speak.
Yeah, okay, but you're just.
I couldn't
just
see,
cla-
and I
just-
wanted to be
it was just a
absolutely sure.
clarification issue.
All right,
Okay, so, so now, to return to the idea of the, whether these recommendations, and I think they may not, sufficiently cover the outstanding issues that were identified last time, particularly the thing about system focus or system direction versus individual cases. So what, if anything, needs to be added or changed among these ideas up here, along those lines? Mr. Chairman?
Well, I want to see 2, 5, and 6. Goal 2, items 5 and 6, that's
Hold
what
on a minute.
relates to that.
Are you?
Hold on, I'm just
Scroll down.
editing, sorry. Okay, you wanna go to work?
Goal 2,
Scroll down.
items 5 and 6. Okay, there we go.
There you go.
Let me see what it says now. Anyone have authority to recommend changes to any policy?
Sorry, my
The
fault.
chief must respond. Okay, see, to me, but 5 and 6 there cover those two issues. What it doesn't say, what we've struggled with, is how much time should be spent on each. But we've made it broad enough and clear enough in the language of what we're suggesting that we're putting a greater emphasis on trends and policies. But it doesn't exclude civilian complaints because it's in item 6.
Excuse me for interjecting, I have a time check. We were supposed to go to 8:15. We still have some outstanding things to discuss. I'm certainly able to stay as long as you would like to, and is it okay to extend it? I just know that the task force has been pretty disciplined about its time frame, and I didn't want to presume anything. Is it okay if we go another 15, 20 minutes or not?
I think that we should keep going. I think we're pretty close.
Well, I do too,
These
but
are the-
again, I don't want to be presumptuous.
These are the nut issues that we've got to finish.
Okay, so if it's all right, we'll just keep going. I'm sorry, you
I'm
spoke,
done.
Mr. So what else about the systems issue, Mr. Ms. Erickson?
I guess I'm concerned that, I understand the way this was written was so that it left it up to the board to decide how much it gets into the individual complaints. I would be very disappointed if the result was that the letter from the IRO was that they didn't hear any appeals, that they didn't hear individual complaints. So I'm a little bit uncomfortable leaving open the possibility that the individual complaints are even less public than they are now.
Mr. Berlin?
I think that I agree with Mr. Erickson on the point of the appeals. Perhaps we should make it explicit, an explicit statement that the board of this new agency is the Board of Appeals on specific complaints. But I would rather go with the POC subcommittee's description of what that subcommittee felt it was the division, which is largely the board being dedicated to policy issues, and that they specific complaint.
Accuracy, to ensure the accuracy of the summaries of the product. Accuracy and quality of the product that is received from staff.
Let's do separate one. So it may,
Replacing 7 or adding?
yes, please.
Investigative file, including transcripts of interviews with all witnesses.
Should it be when it deems necessary, or should it, because that indicates that you're aiming at, oh, we've got a question about what you did in a specific case, or should it be
On a random basis.
randomized so that you're really just looking at instead of targeting a complaint, you're
The
looking at.
access on a randomized basis? On a randomized basis.
What are your proposing?
That's probably satisfactory. It seems procedurally a little bit
Yeah.
weird.
We understand, the concern is that
we want to make sure that,
A formula that's not divulged.
Examine
In certain cases aren't targeted.
yeah, that certain
As
officers
deemed
or
necessary.
certain cases aren't targeted.
Well, I
For
think
informing policy.
Hold on just a second.
if they're going to have access, well, right now, there seems to be possibly some legal impediment to getting that total information anyway. If we're able to, if the people who actually write the ordinance are able to find a way around that, I don't see any reason why they wouldn't always have all of that information when they audit the cases. So maybe it would be most straightforward just to say that the board shall have access to full investigative file, including transcripts of all witness interviews.
To full investigative.
So just get rid of the randomized basis. Whenever they audit individual complaints,
Yeah.
they should have access to all of the entire investigative file.
Including officer records.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Witnesses with officers.
Okay. I've just been noticing, and you have too, people are beginning to take breaks. So I'm wondering whether, even though we're over time, you want to keep moving, just move along, or should we take a 5 to 10 minute break just to sort of stretch legs and then keep going? I'm okay to keep going. if
I
you
think we
want.
should keep going, but maybe we could take like a 2-minute break.
Or if someone needs to take a break,
Just-
take a
just-
break. We'll just
If
keep
you need to take a
Okay.
break, take a break. It's
All right.
okay. All right, I just want to get the process rules.
Should I remove this section?
To full investigative files, including individual case transcripts. Yes.
Including transcripts of witness interviews.
Oh, don't
including
leave the
officer
room,
interviews.
anybody.
Of
Nobody will have
witness interviews.
Transcripts of witness interviews, including officer interviews.
So, Nancy, you gotta leave, huh? Oh,
No,
no,
I'm
you're just,
home.
oh, you're just cold, okay.
Yeah.
We better get them over.
All right, so, does this mean that this, is it generally agreed that this language here should be now removed? Because, that this handles it basically?
Yes.
Yes.
So, wait, leave out the, wait a minute, come
What
back
about
with subpoena.
Oh, God.
Just leave the subpoena one.
I think, well, as I read it last week, subpoena didn't have a lot of, it was sort of a split half and half. You want to go for the subpoena file? I just noticed earlier that both Mr. Hicks and Mr. Wagner said, let's separate this comment out from the subpoena issue. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Yes.
I am not as concerned about the subpoena as long as the actual investigators can always compel these interviews, to the extent that they can do so.
And the agency can see the transcripts.
Right, so if it gets all the way up to the board and they say,
Subpoena's a
well, no
loaded term.
information, I think I don't necessarily need to get in a situation where individual officers are hauled up in front of the board. I would be satisfied if they can be hauled up in front of somebody else and then report back in full.
Okay. All right.
Notwithstanding what I said about let the council decide, I don't want to get into that like there's other things because that's such a hot button.
So we've got that then, looks like. Are there other issues before the preamble discussion that need to be discussed?
I will leave the room more often.
Ms. Armijo.
Oh, sorry.
I have a question. Nowhere have we addressed the POC's responsibility to maintain communication with the outside community. Hasn't that been the biggest complaint, that there's
One
no
of them.
transparency? And that they never, I don't know how we address that, but.
Well, one of the MGT recommendations was to expand broader contact and outreach to the public. So we could put in another bullet or whatever that says that. We recommend that the board develop PR materials and outreach efforts to reach a much broader section of the public and greater understanding of the appeal, complaint process.
As this outline is presently constructed, would you like it under the idea of authority or under the idea of community representation goal? Or a separate, or a whole?
I think a
goal?
separate goal.
That the civilian,
Community
the
outreach.
civilian
Community relations.
oversight agency will improve community outreach.
We'll develop a brochure and a marketing campaign to provide greater outreach to the public.
Sorry,
And then we're taking our own community outreach plan and with periodic reporting, not only a plan, but follow through and report of what that outreach has been.
So underneath, okay, then we'll develop a program of community outreach and
Community outreach plan.
Well, develop a program, develop and implement a program.
develop and implement a program of community outreach and,
With the intent of reaching a broader section of the community.
okay.
We can fix it later.
And report to someone, they should report.
Okay, and so
So, is that the city council?
So a recommendation would be, under that, the Civilian Oversight Agency will periodically report to the community on its,
Or report to the city council
To the city.
on its community outreach success.
Okay, bring a broader, what did you say?
And periodically.
Reaching a
report to-
broader
Okay.
segment of the community.
Segment of the community.
I'm not sure we're reaching any section of the community right now.
Well, and then, just a second, and then 16.
I'm serious.
I know you are, but.
Recommendation.
Can't say
The
that.
community.
So under it says recommendation.
They have a subcommittee, but I don't know if they're doing anything.
They were stopped.
By the city attorney's
Yeah.
office.
What Mr. Bray is recommending is, I think the board, the COA, the agency, will annually or periodically report its activities and successes, outreaches
and feedback
to the city council.
to the city council.
You know, again, that's kind of ordinance thing,
Yeah,
but to me. but-
Well, that, it's a recommendation, so I'm just asking, are there responses to that? You like it?
And the idea, it does. it
Yeah,
puts
no, I hear you.
the
I
city
can take
council
it
on
on
the
the
spot.
spot. I just don't want to get too specific.
And that's the reason for periodic.
Okay. Mr. White, yes.
Actually, before we go to preamble,
Yes.
I think on the issue of selection, we were kind of all over the place. And what I would propose for that section is assume, I think, there was agreement that the mayor should not be involved. That the task force was was split about whether or not the members should be selected by the council or by a committee selected by the council.
If I may, I think you're right that we haven't nailed that down, but I don't know if you want to leave that to a formal vote, but if you can go back to 9 or something, 9 or 10, 9, I think it is. All right, 9 and 10 and 11.
Yeah, and that was, whether or not there's expert positions or because that much.
Right. I heard that there's still, a couple of people still would support the idea that the mayor would appoint some of the positions. But my observation is the minority opinion at this point. Your second point was, I can't remember now.
My main point is we have to do something about it.
Okay, so, do you want to, do we need to discuss it further in this informal gathering, or do you want to then go to a formal motion? Because there are a couple of alternatives. One is.
I was just going to say, I think it would help if you summarized.
I can try. Go ahead.
If not, I can try. To the best of your ability, the 2 or 3 scenarios, and maybe we could discuss it a little more and then bring it to a vote.
Here are the 3 scenarios that I heard. One is really as Mr. Siegel, along the lines of Mr. Siegel's recommendation during public
3, 3, and 3. That leaves open the question of, as I think you mentioned earlier, how would the community groups actually get selected to select the 3? Then the other 2 are a 9-person, again, a 9-person board, one of which would be, one path would be completely at large, and the selection committee would have a set of criteria that they would have to meet in selecting those at-large positions. The other one would be 9 and 5 at-large, and 4 with very definite professional or technical backgrounds slotted for those 4 positions. I think that's what they are.
Say number 2 again.
Number 2 is, the
first one is
3, 3, and 3.
3.
Second one is 9 at-large positions with a selection committee having criteria, and you entrust them to try to make their best play at a broad range of community backgrounds and skills and experiences.
Right, so
And
we
then
give
the-
in general direction about.
Yes, more general direction,
Yeah,
but, and then the other one is that 5 would be generally from the community, 4 would be from the community background, designated expertise. At this point, probably legal, policy, and police backgrounds.
I would support option number 2, at-large selection committee to decide criteria for the selection, and then recommend people to the city council for final approval.
I support number 2 with the caveat that I think we have to say something about who should be on the selection.
Okay, and we would need to come back to that, and any suggestions would be helpful, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I'm kind of in the same boat, but different in terms of, I think we need to be, more specific in defining the criteria. So I'm okay with number 2 if the description of the criteria reflects more what's in number 3. I think the idea of trying to structure a specific selection committee that represents the community is going to be too difficult. You have to decide, well, which agencies and all that stuff. But if you give general guidelines to who should actually sit on the board, I think you can leave it up to the wisdom of those 5 people on the selection committee. I'm very against having the mayor have any say in the selection of the selection committee or the people who sit on the board. Because this is a citizen group, it's not.
So in the,
As a just, the way the city has at least worked in the past, and the boards have been appointed in different ways, but in general, the mayor actually proposes board members to the city council, and the council approves them or not, So I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but to say that the mayor should be left out, it doesn't thrill me. The other part that doesn't thrill me is to require expertise. That doesn't mean that we don't want expertise. I think requiring them presents a problem, and that's the same problem that we're having when we want to define roads, which is there will be a tendency for certain expertise to be doing things that are largely professionally based and administrative in nature, and not focus on what I think the main role should be for the board side, which is road policy. This is where we're going to gain the most ground in the long run, is policy, not looking, and to the extent that they need information to inform policy, that's,
How does that
fine.
get to what?
But that's where I'm at, okay? So
So-
all these things are interwoven.
So let's try to,
Option
again,
two.
go from recommendation to recommendation. What I'm now, if we could, I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm splitting the baby here, but it sounds like, could we say, or a fourth alternative would be the idea of at-large, 9 at-large, and the selection committee will make sure that among the people that they recommend to the city council, there is legal expertise, there is police and public safety expertise, there is public policy expertise. I'm just trying, yes, Ms. Wagner?
I'm opposed to any restriction like that.
Yeah, so just 9 at large. So okay, so that's in fact, what I said was basically just a variation on the one I think you began the discussion with, Mr. Chairman. So it's basically at large, leaving it up to the wisdom of the selection committee, as long as they demonstrate that there's a breadth of community skills, expertise, community experience. Or do we designate that professional expertise?
But in practical terms, that's actually going to happen. The council is going to be appointing these people. They're not going to go look for people that don't represent the community. I mean, come on, you know?
Well, the selection committee.
Or the selection committee, you know? But ultimately, the city council is going to appoint these people. So they will
The
instruct.
city council hasn't been doing that so far.
I do think we put your finger, or you've implied the distinction between what the intent of the recommendations are and what the letter of the recommendations are, because you don't want a future city council to misconstrue. So there's always this tension. How much do you leave up to the future and how much do you tell them?
And I like to see some wording there that provides a little bit of guidance in the selection of some of these folks. And this is where I get to a couple of individuals. If there is some technical expertise on the board, some technical knowledge of public safety procedures. Whether it's a professor, an attorney, FBI agent, Secret Service, someone that might be able to provide you with some guidance, just as a general rule. So though we may not mandate it, at least there's some language in there that we encourage it. So we put out there some consideration for those who have technical understanding.
How do you want to, we have a couple here. I'm a little worried we're starting to actually have the motion discussion without the motion.
I think so, too.
And I do think that we have some,
I think in order to make a final decision on this, because we'll keep talking around it and around it and around it, we're gonna have to put a motion on the table and argue it out and see where we get with the vote.
I'm okay with that. Just to move things along.
I think we should. All right?
We're at that point.
If you don't mind, I'd like to actually say we've got a set of draft of recommendations for your consideration in a formal voting setting, and that we do need to move to the other proposed, other proposed language that was offered up by a small group, ad hoc committee. And so I think I'd like to turn it over to either Nancy, Hans, or Alan to say something about this and just to introduce the background for the conversation.
The background is actually, in part it's a response to certain recent developments in legal opinions, but in part it's also, I was, for 6 years, I worked for CYFD, and the Children's Code has a preamble, which is extremely useful when arguing about what does this provision of the law mean in the Children's Code, and it starts out the way this one does, and I'm trying to figure out, because you're never going to eliminate all ambiguity, and when you stated legislative intent, it makes it much easier to figure out what the legislative body wanted. And part of the argument that we got that's happened recently from about what the POC ordinance means is the lack of legislative history and the lack of statement of intent in the ordinance. So this was designed to provide a context when looking at a statement in the ordinance that might be ambiguous, and well, it could mean this or it could mean that, to provide a guideline, guidance in what it meant. And I think because this is an open meeting, I think before anybody votes on it, I think it has to get read all loud, so I'll do that.
Sure.
This is a proposed preamble to both this report to express the sentiment of the task force and propose that it be in the ordinance as well. This report and any police oversight ordinance shall be interpreted and construed to effectuate the following legislative purposes. A, to foster and perpetuate policing policies and practices that effectively maintain social order and which at the same time foster mutual trust and cooperation between the police and the citizenry. B, to ensure that the civilian police oversight body functions as independently as possible from the executive and legislative branches of the government of the city of Albuquerque. C, to provide citizens and police officers a fair and impartial forum for adjudication of grievances against individual police officers and against the department as a whole. D, to gather and analyze data on trends, complaints, impacts, and practices concerning the actions of the Albuquerque Police Department, the impact of those actions on the community, and the impact of those actions on police-community relations. E, to provide policy guidance to the city council, the mayor, and the chief of police, including guidance on police procedures and guidelines. And there's a semicolon there, should be a period. And just to get everything on that we did, there's a proposed legislative finding. I would expect that the council would come up with more reasons for doing this, but from this, the legislative finding I propose is to make clear that just because the council takes action, that doesn't mean that all issues are even close to being resolved. And I'm proposing the legislative finding. The most effective way to achieve and maintain a healthy police-community relationship is a genuine commitment accompanied by action consistent with the commitment from the executive branch of the government of the city of Albuquerque, from the mayor down through the chief of police and through the police chain of command, to police tactics, training, and policies which foster good police-community relationships and trust. And I'll tell you that the MGT report that pointed out that basically civilian police oversight is playing around the edges. It's not worth anything unless